Alistair Crow slammed the foreclosure papers onto Edwin Vale's kitchen table, so hard the coffee cups rattled off their saucers and shattered on the floor. "Sign it," he said. Just 2 words, cold as the winter coming down from the mountain. Edwin's hands were shaking. He'd been drinking since before breakfast. Everyone in Red Hollow knew it, and he could barely hold. The pen crow was already pushing toward his fingers. Tessa stood in the doorway, watching her father shrink. Watching the man who once built fences with his bare hands fold like wet paper in front of a banker in a clean suit. She was 19 years old, and Crow wasn't looking at her father when he said his next words. He was looking directly at her. "There is one other arrangement that would settle this debt entirely. If you've ever had to make a decision that wasn't really a choice, stay with me. Because this story is going to go places you won't see coming. Subscribe to this channel and follow along to the end, and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels." The morning Alistair Crow came to the Vale farm, the frost hadn't even lifted off the grass yet. Tessa had been up since before dawn the way she always was, because someone had to be. Her father had stumbled in sometime past midnight, knocking over the lamp in the hallway, and she'd lain in her bed, listening to him find the wall, find the stairs, find his room. She'd stopped going to check on him months ago. There was nothing left to check on. He was either standing or he wasn't. Either way, morning came and she had work to do. She'd already fed the 2 remaining chickens, already hauled water from the well, already started what passed for breakfast cornmeal and whatever eggs she could find when she heard the carriage wheels on the frozen road. The Vale farm sat at the low end of a long, sloping property that had once been genuinely beautiful. Her grandfather had cleared it himself, row by row. Her father had grown up here, married here, buried her mother here when Tessa was 11. There were apple trees along the south fence that hadn't been properly tended in 3 years, and the barn had a section of roof that bowed inward, like it was tired of holding itself up. But it was theirs, or it had been. Tessa watched from the kitchen window as the carriage stopped. Crow stepped down first. She recognized him immediately. That long black coat, the silver watch chain that he wore purely to be seen wearing it. He had 2 men with him. They stayed by the carriage. That was the detail she noticed, that they didn't come to the door. That they stood back like they were already done with whatever was about to happen inside. She dried her hands on a dish towel. She didn't wake her father. She answered the door herself. Miss Vale Crow took off his hat. He had the kind of manners that weren't really manners at all, the kind that existed to make other people feel the distance between them. "Is your father available?" "He will be," she said. "Come in." She shouldn't have let him in. She understood that later, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a decision you can't unmake. She should have stood in the doorway and told him to come back at a decent hour with a lawyer present. But she was 19, and she'd grown up watching her father flinch in front of men like Crow, and somewhere along the way she'd learned to manage things before they could get worse. So she let him in. She made coffee, real coffee, not the grain stuff, because her mother had taught her that you feed people and offer warmth, and that's how decent folks behave. She set a cup in front of Crow at the kitchen table and went upstairs to get her father. Edwin Vale was not a bad man. That was the thing about him, the thing that made it all so much harder. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't stupid. He'd just been beaten down by grief so gradually and so completely that by the time Tessa was old enough to understand what was happening, he was already mostly gone. Her mother's death had taken something essential out of him. The same way a fire takes the center beam out of a house, everything still standing, but nothing holding weight anymore. She shook his shoulder. "Papa, get up. Crow is here." He groaned, blinked. The smell in the room was stale and sour. "What time is it?" "Early. Get up." He came downstairs in his work shirt, unshaven, squinting against the gray morning light coming through the kitchen windows. He looked at Crow the way a dog looks at something that has already heard it, before not surprised, just braced. Crow slid the papers across the table before Edwin had even fully sat down. The loan from the Holloway Bank, Crow said. It came due on the 1st. You're aware of that. I need more time, Edwin said. His voice was rough with sleep and something else. I told your man last week the harvest was short and I just need. You needed more time last spring, Crow said, and the spring before that. If you'd just give me until Edwin, Crow said the name quietly. Not unkind, exactly. More the way you speak to someone you've already decided about. The bank holds the mortgage on this property. You are 4 months in default. That is not a matter of needing more time. That is a matter of legal fact. Tessa was standing by the stove. She kept her hands still because she'd learned to be very still when things were bad, the way small creatures go motionless when a larger one is nearby. What are the numbers? She said. Both men looked at her. I'm sorry, Crow said. The debt. What are the exact numbers? What's owed, what's accumulated in fees, and what does it add up to today? Crow looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her, with the particular surprise of someone who didn't expect the furniture to ask questions. Then he told her. The original loan, the interest, the penalty fees, the back taxes the bank had allegedly covered. The number was wrong. She knew it was wrong the moment she heard it, because she had been keeping her own informal accounts since she was 16, scratching figures into the inside cover of an old almanac she kept behind the flour tin. The number Crow was quoting was higher than it should have been by a margin that wasn't a rounding error. She didn't say that, not yet. She didn't know enough yet to say it safely. And if the debt is settled, she said, in full the farm is ours outright. It would be, Crow said. He had already set the pen down beside the papers. That number can't be raised between now and any settlement. Something shifted in Crow's face. Not much. Just enough. It's a fixed balance. Edwin reached for the pen. Tessa said, Papa, don't. He looked at her. His hand was already on the pen. He had the look of someone who just wanted it to be over any version of over, even the worst one. There has to be another way, she said. Crow leaned back slightly in his chair. He turned the silver watch chain once around his finger, the way she would come to learn he always did when he was about to say something he'd already decided to say. Something he wanted to appear spontaneous. There is one other arrangement, he said slowly, as if the idea were just occurring to him. It would clear the debt entirely. What kind of arrangement? Tessa said. There is a man who has indicated an interest. Crow paused, choosing his words a serious interest in a family connection to the Vale name. He is willing to assume the debt entirely. Every cent. In exchange for a marriage. The kitchen went completely silent. Edwin's head came up. His eyes moved to Crow, then to Tessa, then back to Crow, and Tessa watched her father do the math the way a drowning man counts pieces of floating wood. Who, she said. Flat, not even a question. Gideon Rourke, Crow said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Even Tessa, who had spent years training herself not to react to things in front of people like Crow, felt it hit her somewhere in the chest. Because she knew that name. Everyone in Red Hollow knew that name. Gideon Rourke was the man on the mountain, the one with the burned hands and the scarred face who hadn't come into town in years. The one the children said was dangerous. The one the adults said was worse than dangerous, because he was unpredictable, and unpredictable men were the kind you couldn't reason with or run from. There were stories. There were always stories in a small town. That he'd killed a man in a mining dispute. That he'd gone mad after the collapse. The locked room in his house on Ironwood Ridge held things nobody decent would want to know about. Tessa had never believed stories like that entirely, because she'd also grown up hearing stories about her father that he drank because he was weak, that he'd ruined a good farm through laziness, and those stories were both partly true and entirely unfair at the same time. Stories flattened people into whatever shape was easiest for everyone else to carry. But Gideon Rourke on the mountain was not a story she had ever expected to find herself inside. He's twice my age, she said. He's 38, Crow said. The farm would be clear. Your father would have time to get back on his feet. And you would be provided for, which is... He glanced at the cracked plaster above the window, at the bucket on the floor positioned to catch the drip from the ceiling more than current circumstances allow. She looked at her father. Edwin Vale was not a bad man. He was a man who had been broken, slowly, over years, by grief and failure, and the particular cruelty of a world that keeps asking things of you after it's already taken what mattered most. He was sitting at his own kitchen table, looking at his daughter with eyes that already knew what he was going to do and hated himself for it. Tessa, he said, just her name. It was the most honest thing he'd said in years. She looked away from him. She looked out the window at the frost, still on the grass, at the apple trees along the fence that nobody had tended properly, at the barn with the bowing roof that was still, somehow, standing. She thought about her grandfather clearing this land row by row. She thought about her mother buried in the south corner of the property, under the oak tree, because that was the spot she'd always said was the prettiest in the late afternoon. She thought if they lose the farm, they lose her too. And then she thought something else, something she wouldn't admit to herself for a long time. But that was there all the same, quiet and hard and honest. At least on that mountain, she would be out of this room. I'll need a week, she said, not to her father, to Crow. Crow looked up. Before I agree to anything, Tessa said, I need 1 week to look over the figures myself. The loan amounts, the interest schedule, all of it. I'm not signing anything on my behalf or my father's without seeing the original documentation. Crow studied her for a long moment. That watch chain turned slowly around his finger. You have 3 days, he said. He left without finishing his coffee. Tessa stood at the window and watched the carriage until it disappeared down the frozen road. She stood there for a long time after it was gone. Her father had already gone back upstairs. She went and found her almanac behind the flour tin and opened it to the back cover where she kept her numbers. She wrote down everything Crow had said, the amounts, the dates, the fees. She wrote it all down because she'd learned early that the only defense against men like him was knowing the exact shape of what they were building around you. The numbers were wrong. She was more certain of it now than she had been in the kitchen. But she was also certain of something else. 3 days was not enough time to prove it. Not without access to the original loan documents. Not without someone who understood banking law, and in Red Hollow the only lawyers worked for the bank or worked for men who worked with the bank, which amounted to the same thing. She had 3 days and no real options, and a father upstairs who was already, she knew, reaching for the bottle he kept in the nightstand. She pressed the almanac flat on the counter. She thought about Gideon Rourke. She had seen him once, years ago, before everything fell apart, before the mine disaster, before her mother died, before the town's memory of him became entirely made of rumors. He'd come into Red Hollow for supplies, and she'd been maybe 13, standing outside the dry goods store, and she'd watched him move through the street. He was bigger than she'd expected even then. He walked like a man who was used to space, who found crowds uncomfortable, not because he was afraid of people, but because he genuinely couldn't understand why so many of them needed to be so close together. He hadn't seemed frightening. He'd seemed tired. That was the only clear thing she remembered, how tired he looked. She closed the almanac. She thought, a tired man is not the same as a dangerous one. She thought, but she could be wrong about that. She had been wrong about things before. She thought, the farm is sitting on top of her mother's grave, and she is not going to let Alistair Crow take it without a fight. On the morning of the 3rd day, Edwin came downstairs sober, which was rare enough that it felt important, and sat at the kitchen table and looked at his daughter across the breakfast she'd made. You don't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. He stopped. They both knew he couldn't. Papa, she put down her fork. I need you to promise me something. He looked at her. While I'm gone, she said, if I agree to this, I need you to try. Really try. Not for me, I'm past needing it for me. But because you're still here, and there's still time, And I think somewhere in you, you know that. His jaw worked. He was not a man who cried, but his eyes had a shine to them that she recognized. I'll try, he said. She didn't know if he meant it. She hoped he did. She had learned at 19 that sometimes hope is the most honest position available. She put on her coat. She walked to Crow's office and told him she would agree to the arrangement. Crow smiled. Not wide, just enough. The wedding was set for the following Friday. At the courthouse, just a judge and a witness and papers to sign barely more formal than the foreclosure documents had been. The townspeople heard about it the way small towns always hear about things in pieces, through side conversations, through the look on one person's face that tells you something has happened before they open their mouth. By Tuesday, half of Red Hollow knew. By Thursday, all of it did. They talked about it the way they talked about accidents. With that particular mix of horror and fascination that happens when something terrible is happening to someone else, and you are grateful quietly and shamefully that it isn't happening to you. The women who passed Tessa on the street looked at her with a kind of pity so unguarded it was almost rude. One woman she barely knew pressed her hand at the general store and said, "You poor child," which Tessa thought was both kind and entirely useless. She was not, she felt, a poor child. She was a young woman making the least bad decision available to her with the information and options she had. That was not the same as being pitiful. But she understood that to the town she looked like a girl being led to slaughter, and there was no quick way to explain the difference between desperation and pragmatism to people who had already decided what they were seeing. Friday came. The courthouse was small and cold. The judge was a man named Harlan Bess, who she knew had once played cards with her grandfather, which she found both comforting and strange. Crow was there, standing to one side, and Tessa noticed that he looked satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with her happiness, and everything to do with something else she couldn't yet name. Gideon Rourke walked in 7 minutes late. He was bigger than she remembered. The scar she'd heard about ran from below his left ear, down along his jaw, not grotesque, not what the stories had made it, just a fact of his face, the way a knot is a fact of wood. His hands were large, and she could see, even from across the room, that they'd been burned at some point and healed imperfectly. He didn't look at her right away. He looked at the judge. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Crow with a steady, flat expression that was not neutral. There was something behind it. And then finally, his eyes moved to her. She held his gaze. She was terrified. She was not going to let him see that. He gave her a single slow nod, like he was acknowledging something real. Like he understood, at least on some level, that she was standing here doing something hard. They signed the papers. The judge said the words. Crow smiled from his spot against the wall. And Tessa Vale became Tessa Rourke in a courthouse that smelled like old wood and lamp oil, while people stood outside in clusters and waited to hear whether the bride had survived the ceremony. When she walked out with Gideon, the crowd went quiet. Not the quiet of respect, the quiet of people watching something they expect to go wrong. Gideon's wagon was waiting. He helped her up with one of those burned hands, not grabbing, just offering she could take it or not, and she took it because she was going to need to learn how to be in the same space as this man, and it might as well start now. They drove out of Red Hollow without speaking. The mountain road climbed for almost an hour. The trees thickened. The town fell away below them like a dream you're already forgetting. At some point, without planning to, Tessa said, "There's a locked room in your house." Gideon's hands tightened slightly on the reins, just slightly. "Yes," he said. "I'm not asking about it," she said. "I'm just telling you I know it's there." He looked at her sideways. "Just once, then back at the road, all right," he said. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. The kind that has something in it, rather than nothing. When Ironwood Ridge came into view, the house, the timber yard, the sheer overwhelming size of the mountain forest surrounding it, Tessa looked at it and felt something she hadn't expected. It was strange and it was remote, and it was nothing like the life she had imagined for herself. But it was real, and she was still here. That would have to be enough to start. The first night on Ironwood Ridge, Tessa did not sleep. She lay in the room Gideon had shown her, a clean room, which surprised her, with a wood-frame bed and a quilt that was old but not dirty, and a window that faced east so the first light would come through in the morning, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her. Old houses talk. They creak and groan and shift in ways that sound in the dark like footsteps. She kept her breathing even and reminded herself that she knew how to be in unfamiliar places. She had moved her mother's furniture after the funeral. She had rearranged her whole understanding of what home meant before she was 12. She could do this, but the mountain was louder than she expected. Wind through pine trees is not a gentle sound. It is something that moves, that changes pitch, that sometimes sounds almost like a voice saying something just below the threshold of words. She lay there and listened to it, and thought about the number in her almanac, which she had tucked into the bottom of the small bag she'd packed for herself. The wrong numbers. Crow's wrong numbers, she thought. I did not come up here to disappear. I came up here to buy time. She wasn't sure yet what she was going to do with that time. But she knew she needed it. In the morning, she found Gideon in the kitchen. He had already made coffee, real coffee, black, in an iron pot, and there was bread on the table that he'd clearly bought in town before the wedding because it was still reasonably fresh. He was standing at the window looking out at the timber yard when she came in, and he didn't startle or turn with excessive welcome. He just said, without looking away from the window, "Coffee's on the stove." "Thank you," she said. She poured herself a cup and stood on the other side of the kitchen, and they were quiet for a while. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the quiet of two people who had been dropped into a situation neither of them fully chose and were both trying to figure out the terms. "I'll need to understand how the house runs," she said eventually. "What you expect? Who does what?" He turned from the window then. He looked at her for a moment in that particular way he had, like he was reading something, checking whether it matched what he'd expected, and then he said, "I don't expect anything from you." "That's not practical," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not, but it's the truth." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "Who cooks?" "I do. I'm not good at it, I am," she said. "So that's settled." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. "All right." "What else? The timber yard runs 6 days a week. I'm out there from before light until it gets dark. Amos Creed runs the men. He's been with me 12 years. You'll meet him today. The house is yours while I'm working. I won't." He stopped. Chose the words carefully. "I won't come into your room. That's yours. The rest of the house is shared space." She looked at him steadily. He met her eyes without flinching. "In the locked room," she said. The muscle in his jaw tightened. "Just once. That's mine." "Understood," she said, and she meant it for now. She meant it the way you agree to a rule you're not sure yet is fair, because you know there will be time to understand it better, and rushing usually makes things worse. She cooked that first morning, eggs and salt pork and the rest of the bread, and when Amos Creed came to the back door to get Gideon abroad, weathered man in his 50s with a gray beard and eyes that had seen enough to be permanently careful, he stopped and stared at the plates on the table like they were something remarkable. "Cooked," he said to Gideon. "She did," Gideon said. Amos looked at Tessa with an expression that was hard to read but not unfriendly. He took off his hat. "Amos Creed, ma'am. Timber foreman." "Tessa," she said. "Not Mrs. Rourke. Just Tessa." She wasn't ready for the other thing yet. Amos nodded like that was exactly right and said nothing else about it, which told her immediately that he was a man of reasonable sense. The first week passed the way first weeks in strange places always do, in a series of small discoveries and adjustments, each one minor, but accumulating into a new understanding of where you are. She learned that the water from the well on the north side of the house ran cleaner than the south well. She learned that Gideon took his coffee without anything in it and drank 3 cups before he spoke more than 20 words to anyone. She learned that there was a dog, a gray, grizzled thing named Bishop, that lived mostly outside but came in when it rained, and that Gideon fed him from his own plate when he thought no one was watching, which told her something. She learned that the house had been well built, built by someone who knew timber and knew structures built to last. There were details in it, a particular way the window frames were joined, a curved piece of molding above the fireplace that were not practical details. They were the details of someone who built a home with care, because they were building it for people they loved. She didn't ask about that either. Not yet. What she did do, on the fourth day, was go through the kitchen drawers more carefully than she had before. Not snooping, she was looking for a larger pot she'd noticed was missing, and in the third drawer she found, beneath a folded piece of canvas, a bundle of papers bound with brown string. She looked at them for a long moment, then she untied the string. They were receipts, lumber receipts, supply invoices, payroll records, ordinary business documents. But stapled to the inside of the bundle's cover was something different. A letter on Holloway Bank letterhead, dated 14 months ago, addressed to Gideon, laying out the terms of what was described as a mutual business arrangement between Ironwood Ridge Timber and the Holloway Bank Group. She read it twice. Then she went back to the almanac and she read her numbers again. There was a transportation corridor. She'd heard people in town mention it vaguely. The kind of thing that was in the air, but never clearly explained. A railroad or a freight road going through the Eastern Territories. Something that would need to pass through specific land to be viable. She hadn't connected it to Ironwood Ridge. She hadn't thought about it specifically. She thought about it now. The land Gideon owned sat at the only practical pass through the range. Without it, a corridor would have to go 30 miles out of the way around the southern ridge, adding cost, time, years of additional construction. With it, the project became significantly more profitable for whoever controlled the route. Crow's Bank had been positioning itself as the financial broker for that corridor. She sat at the kitchen table and thought very carefully about the shape of what she was seeing. Crow had manufactured a debt that made it impossible for Edwin to keep the farm. He had offered a marriage as the solution not out of any interest in Tessa or Gideon or the Vale family, but because marrying Tessa to Gideon created a legal tie between the two properties. A tie that, with the right documents and the right legal pressure, could be leveraged. If Gideon defaulted on anything, or if the marriage created any kind of joint liability situation, Crow might be able to claim interest in Ironwood Ridge itself. The marriage wasn't about her. It wasn't even really about Gideon. It was about the land beneath their feet. She stayed at the table for a long time after that. She was not someone who panicked. She had learned young that panic burns energy you need for thinking, and she needed to think clearly right now more than she needed to feel anything. But beneath the thinking, there was something cold and furious and very, very focused. That evening when Gideon came in from the timber yard, covered in sawdust and smelling of pine resin and honest work, she was waiting at the table. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her. He pulled out a chair and sat without argument. That was another thing she was learning about him. He didn't waste energy on resistance when he could see something real was happening. She laid the bank letter on the table between them. She watched his face. He looked at the letter. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he said very quietly, "Where did you find this?" "Kitchen drawer. I was looking for a pot." That's not, he stopped himself. Started again. "I didn't hide it from you intentionally." "I'd forgotten it was there. I need you to tell me about the corridor," she said. Something shifted in his face, something heavy. He leaned back in the chair and put one hand flat on the table, not threatening, just grounding himself, and he looked at the ceiling for a moment like he was deciding how much to say. "The Eastern Freight Corridor," he said, "been talked about for years. 3 groups trying to get the contracts. Crow's Bank is backing one of them. And they need this land. They need the pass," he said. "Yes, and you knew this." He met her eyes. "I've known for 2 years that Crow wanted Ironwood Ridge. I didn't know what form it would take. But you agreed to the marriage anyway. I agreed to a marriage that would keep a young woman from being left with nothing, he said. His voice was flat but not cold. I agreed to a situation where I had some control over what happened. If Crow had found another way in a legal angle, a debt claim, I would have had no position at all. At least this way I could see it coming. She stared at him. You used this marriage as a defensive position. So did you, he said, without any heat. You're not up here because you fell in love with me. She opened her mouth, closed it. That's not a criticism, he said. Just true. We both walked into that courthouse doing math, not poetry. I'm not pretending otherwise. She hated that he was right. She hated it because it made him more real than she wanted him to be right now. And real was complicated, and she already had enough complicated on her hands. The numbers on my father's debt are wrong, she said. He looked at her sharply. The interest rates, the penalty fees. They're higher than they should be, by a margin that's not a mistake. She turned the almanac around and pushed it across to him. Her handwriting, small and precise, filling the back pages. That's what I make of it. I don't have access to the original loan documents. But if I could get them, Gideon was quiet for a long time. He was looking at her numbers the way she'd seen him look at the timber yard in the mornings, like he was assessing load and grain and weight. Who taught you to track accounts like this? He said. Nobody. I just kept track because somebody had to. She said it without bitterness, just as a statement of how things had been. He nodded slowly. I have a contact, he said, a man who used to work at the Holloway Bank before Crow pushed him out. He's in the county seat now. He might be willing to talk about what he knows. But I'd need a reason to go to him that doesn't tip Crow off that I'm looking. How long have you had this contact? A year, Gideon said. And you haven't used him. I was waiting. For what? He looked at her. There was something in his face that was difficult to name, not quite guilt, not quite calculation. Something more honest than either of those. I don't know, he said. Maybe I was waiting to have something to show him. A reason it was worth the risk. She looked at the almanac, then at him. Would my numbers be a reason? He was quiet for a moment. Then they might be. She picked up the almanac and closed it. Then we should make a plan, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she felt it. Then he said, You are not what I expected. What did you expect? He thought about it. Somebody who cried, he said. I cry, she said. I just do it when it's useful. That surprised a sound out of him, not quite a laugh, short and low and unpracticed, like something that had been stored away so long it had forgotten it was laughter. She hadn't expected that, and it caught her off guard, and she looked away from him at the almanac in her hands. Tomorrow, she said, I want to see the full property. Where the pass is, what it looks like. That's a hard walk. I'm not delicate, she said. He looked at her hands, the rough edges, the healed-over scrapes from years of farm work, and he didn't argue. She went to bed that night, and she lay there in the dark and thought about Crow sitting behind his desk in Red Hollow looking satisfied. She thought about her father's face when he'd handed her the pen. She thought about the orchard along the south fence at the Vale Farm, her grandfather's orchard, and how nobody had properly tended those trees in 3 years. She thought about all the small things that get lost when people stop fighting. She pressed her hand flat on the mattress beneath her and thought, I am not going to let him win. She still didn't sleep well, but she stopped listening to the wind and started thinking instead, which was better. The walk to the pass took 2 hours. Gideon moved through the forest the way people move through rooms they know very well, not quickly, but without hesitation, never pausing to check direction, just going. Tessa followed and watched and said nothing. She was building a map in her head. The timber stands, the grade of the land, where the trees thinned and the rock showed through, where the path naturally narrowed and where it opened. When they reached the pass itself, she stopped. It was not dramatic. It was just a place where 2 ridges came together at an angle that created a natural throat through the mountain wide enough for a road, level enough to grade without serious blasting. On the other side, you could see the valley opening up toward the Eastern Territories. She stood and looked at it for a long time. "This is worth a lot of money," she said. "Yes." To the right people, yes. She turned to look at him. He was watching the valley, not her. His face was the way it always was outdoors, quieter than inside, more settled. Like the forest was a place where he knew the rules and had made a kind of peace. "The house you built," she said, "the details in it. You built it for someone." He didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the tops of the pines. "My wife," he said. "And my daughter." She had suspected it. She'd suspected it since the first morning, since she'd noticed how the kitchen was laid out with a particular logic that wasn't just efficiency, but care, the kind of care that goes into a space that someone specific is going to use every day. But hearing it said out loud was different. "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it the way real condolences are meant, not as a social gesture, but as an acknowledgement that the weight of what he was carrying was real. "It was a long time ago," he said. "How long ago something is doesn't change how much it weighs," she said. He looked at her then, really looked at her. She wasn't sure what he found, but she held it. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't." They walked back mostly in silence, but a different kind of silence than before. The kind that has been opened up rather than shut down. That evening, Amos Creed stayed for dinner, which apparently he did sometimes, pulling up a chair to the table with the comfortable ease of someone who had been doing it for years. She watched him and Gideon talk about the timber yard, about a section of the upper operation that was falling behind schedule, about a man named Rawls who wasn't pulling his weight. They talked the way men who have worked together for a long time talk incomplete sentences, references to things that had happened years ago, shorthand that excluded everyone who hadn't been there. She listened. She filed it away. She was learning the shape of this place. After dinner, when Gideon stepped outside to check on Bishop, Amos leaned back in his chair and looked at her with those careful eyes. "He doesn't talk much," Amos said. "I noticed," she said. "When he does, he means it. I noticed that, too." Amos turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone deciding whether to say something. Then he said, "After Lydia and Nell died, he went 3 months without coming down from this mountain. I came up here every week to make sure he was still breathing. Sometimes he'd open the door, sometimes he wouldn't." She absorbed this. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "'Cause," Amos said, "the only reason he agreed to any of this, the only reason he walked into that courthouse is that your father was decent to him once. After the collapse. When everyone in Red Hollow was treating him like he was either cursed or crazy, your father drove a wagon up here with supplies he couldn't afford and didn't say a word about Gideon's face or his hands or the stories. Just said, 'Figured you might need these,' and turned around and went home." Tessa was very still. "My father never told me that," she said. "Your father doesn't talk about the things he does right," Amos said. "Just the things he does wrong, which is its own kind of problem." She thought about her father sitting at the kitchen table that morning, sober, saying, "I'll try." She thought about how she'd answered that and left. Something shifted in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, that was more complicated and would take more time. But something adjacent to it. A recognition that the picture she'd had of him was not entirely accurate, and that incomplete pictures are dangerous precisely because they feel complete. "Gideon could have said no," she said. "He could have," Amos agreed. "He said no to a lot of things over the years that would have been easier to say yes to. But this one he stopped, shook his head. I think he felt like he owed a debt. That's how he thinks about things, debts and accounts. Everything's a ledger with him." She thought about what Gideon had said at the table. "We both walked into that courthouse doing math, not poetry." She thought, maybe that's not the worst foundation. Maybe that's honest. She was still thinking about it the following week when she found the room. She hadn't meant to. She had been looking for an extra blanket the nights were getting colder, and she'd gone through the upstairs hall past the door she'd noted from her. First night, the one with the iron latch that was always closed. She hadn't tried it. She'd said she wouldn't, and she hadn't. But on this particular morning, the door was not quite latched. The iron bar had not seated properly, and the door had swung an inch inward on its own, and she was standing in the hallway with a lamp in one hand, and she could see through the gap. She stood there for a long moment. Then she pushed the door the rest of the way open. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the house, as if it held its own separate weather. There was a crib against one wall, small, carefully built, the wood pale and smooth. Beside it, a child-sized rocking chair. On the windowsill, a row of small objects, a painted tin horse, a button, a dried flower that had long since lost its color. On the wall, a single framed photograph. She went to the photograph. It was a woman young, with a direct gaze and dark hair pulled back simply, and in her arms a small girl, maybe 2 years old, who had inherited her father's coloring and was squinting against some light outside the frame with an expression of tremendous seriousness. Lydia, Nell. She looked at them for a long time. She looked at the crib, the rocking chair, the tin horse on the windowsill. She looked at the room that held all of this intact, untouched, preserved exactly as it had been, and she understood what this room was. It was not a shrine, not exactly. It was more like the place where someone had stopped time because moving forward felt like leaving. She heard the floorboard in the hallway. She turned. Gideon was standing in the doorway. His face was doing several things at once, none of them simple. She could see the reflex of something that was almost anger, the instinct to shut this down, to close the door, to refuse the intrusion, and she could also see, beneath that, something rawer, something that had been behind that iron latch for a long time. "I'm sorry," she said. "The door wasn't latched. I didn't come looking." It was very still. "I know you didn't," he said. She looked at the photograph, then back at him. "She has your eyes," she said. Nell, the word his daughter's name, said out loud by someone other than him, did something to his face that she would not easily forget. It moved through him like a tremor, not breaking anything, but reaching somewhere deep. He didn't speak. "You built the crib yourself," she said. "Not a question. Yes, the rocking chair too. Yes." She looked at the tin horse on the windowsill. She liked horses? He moved into the room, then moved past her, and picked up the tin horse and held it in one of his large burned hands, and he looked at it for a long moment. "She used to line them up across the breakfast table and make me name each one before I was allowed to eat," he said. His voice had changed, gone quieter, gone back somewhere. She had 7 of them. She named them all herself. This one was Gerald. The name caught Tessa completely off guard, and she made a sound that was half breath and half something else, and she pressed her hand over her mouth for a second, because she was not going to fall apart in this room. She was not. "That's a very serious name for a horse," she managed. She was a very serious child. He set the horse back in its exact spot. He looked at it for a moment more. 3 years old. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that would have been adequate. "The mind collapse," he said, not explaining, just speaking. Like a man who needed to say it out loud occasionally to prove he could still hold it. Lydia and Nell were in the lower camp. There was a cookhouse there, the women and children. He stopped. His jaw tightened. The structural failure sent a shockwave through the camp. "They said it was fast. They told me it was fast. Do you believe them?" she said. He looked at her sharply, like he hadn't expected that question. "No," he said, very quietly, "I don't." She held that with him for a moment. She didn't try to improve it or soften it or tell him he shouldn't feel what he felt. "I don't come in here very much anymore," he said. "But I can't close the house while this room is still—" He stopped again. Set his jaw. "I can't leave them behind." "You're not leaving them behind," she said. "They're here. They'll keep being here. But maybe this room could be not just a place where you stopped. Maybe it could be somewhere you come when you want to remember. Not where you put yourself when you need to punish yourself." He looked at her. "I'm overstepping," she said. "No," he said. "You're just—" He shook his head. "You're direct." "It's a flaw," she said. It's a feature, he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. She looked at the photograph one more time. At Lydia's direct gaze. At Nell squinting against the light with that expression of tremendous seriousness. I'm not trying to replace them, she said. I need you to know that. I didn't come up here to erase anything. I know that, he said. She gestured slightly. At the room, at herself, at the whole improbable situation. I'm here. That's all I know how to be right now. He picked up the photograph in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then he set it back against the wall with the same careful precision he used for everything. That's enough, he said. Just being here is enough. She wasn't sure if he meant enough for him, or enough for a start, or something else entirely. She didn't ask. Some things need time before they can be asked properly. She went back out into the hallway. He followed her and pulled the door nearly shut, not all the way, she noticed. Not latched tight, just resting closed. It was a small thing. She thought it meant something. 3 days later, she went into Red Hollow without telling him. She knew, even as she was saddling one of the horses, that this was going to cause a problem. She knew it the way you know a thing is unwise before you do it, and do it anyway because the alternative is worse. She had found 3 more things in the past week, a secondary set of figures in a supply. Invoice Amos had left on the kitchen table. And 2 conversations she'd overheard in the timber yard between workers that mentioned Crow's name in connection with a man named Lester who worked for the county land office. Small pieces. But they pointed in the same direction as everything else she'd been assembling, and she needed to see her father, and she needed to get to the county records office before the end of the month when certain documents cycled out of public access. She told herself both things were true, which they were. She didn't look too hard at whether she was also simply desperate to check on Edwin. The road down the mountain was easier than she expected. The horse was sure-footed, the trail well-worn, and she reached Red Hollow before noon. She went to her father's farm first. The yard was cleaner than she'd left it. She noticed that immediately. Not by much, but noticeably someone had stacked the split wood properly against the barn wall, and the bucket by the south well was hanging up instead of left in the mud. Edwin answered the door in clean clothes. She stood on the step and looked at him and felt something in her chest ache in a way she hadn't anticipated. You look better, she said. I'm working on it, he said. Come in, she went in. He had coffee on the stove, not fancy, grain coffee but hot. She sat at the kitchen table that she'd grown up sitting at and wrapped her hands around the cup, and he sat across from her, and they were quiet for a moment, in the way of people who have too much to say to know where to start. How is it up there, he said. Strange, she said. But not, she thought about how to say it. He gave me my own room. He hasn't, she stopped. It's not what anyone thinks it is. Edwin was quiet. Papa, she said, why didn't you tell me about after the mine collapse? About going up there with the supplies? He looked down at his coffee cup. A long pause. How do you know about that, he said. Amos Creed told me. He turned the cup in his hands. It wasn't anything. It was something, she said. To him it was something. He shook his head. He was up there alone and everyone was treating him like he'd done something wrong by surviving, and I just thought somebody ought to act like a normal human being toward the man. She looked at her father, at the lines in his face, the rough hands, the clear eyes that were clearer than they'd been in a long time. I'm glad you did, she said. He nodded once, not looking at her. She didn't stay long. She had the county records office to get to, and she couldn't afford to miss the window. She hugged her father at the door. It surprised them both, because they were not their family. Much given to demonstrations, and she felt him hold it for a moment longer than she expected. Be careful, he said. Always. She lied. The county records office was on the main street, tucked between a hardware supply and a printer. She was inside for less than 20 minutes. She knew what she was looking for, because she'd spent 3 weeks thinking about it, and she found enough to confirm what she'd suspected. The original loan document had been altered. Not clumsily, cleverly, but altered nonetheless. a different hand on the penalty clause, a date that didn't quite match the notary stamp. She was copying down the key figures when the door of the office opened behind her. She turned. Two men she didn't know, big, standing in the doorway in a way that blocked the exit without technically being inside yet. "Mrs. Rourke," one of them said, "Mr. Crow would like a word." She looked at the document in her hands. She looked at the door. "I'm not finished here," she said. "That's all right," the man said. Mr. Crow's not in a hurry. He was smiling, but it was not the kind of smile that meant anything good. She thought about making a scene screaming, throwing the papers, but the records clerk had already gone very still and pale behind his desk. The particular stillness of someone who has been intimidated by these men before and is hoping not to be again. Making a scene would put him at risk and get her nothing. She folded what she had carefully and tucked it inside her coat. She went with them. Crow's estate was outside of town, a large house with the kind of deliberate grandeur that was meant to communicate power rather than comfort. He received her in a sitting room that smelled like tobacco and money, standing with his back to the window so the light was in her eyes and not his. She noted this, "Mrs. Rourke," he said. He even smiled, briefly. "You look well. Mountain air suits you, apparently." "What do you want, Mr. Crow?" she said. He let the directness sit for a moment, like he was deciding whether to be charmed or annoyed by it. He settled on something in between. "I want to have a conversation that would benefit everyone," he said. He gestured toward a chair. She did not sit. He continued as if she had. "Your husband is a stubborn man. I've offered him fair value for that mountain, more than fair, on 4 separate occasions. He refuses to engage." "It's his land," she said. "It's a considerable weight to carry," Crow said. "The operation costs, the legal exposure, the memories associated with the property." He said the last part carefully, watching her face. "I imagine you're aware of what happened up there." To his previous family. "I'm aware," she said evenly. "A fresh start somewhere better could be." "Mr. Crow," she said, "I'm not here to negotiate my husband's land on your behalf. I don't have that authority, and I wouldn't use it if I did." The smile faded, just slightly. "You are in a position," he said, "to be either very helpful or very inconvenient, Mrs. Rourke." "I expect that's true," she said. "I would encourage you to consider which of those is in your family's best interest." He turned the watch chain slowly around one finger. "Your father's farm, for instance, is still technically in a legal gray area regarding the debt settlement. The paperwork being complex." She heard that for exactly what it was. "Are you threatening my father?" she said. "I'm explaining a situation," Crow said. "Convince your husband to accept a fair offer. The Vale Farm situation resolves cleanly. Everyone moves forward." She looked at him, at his clean suit, his watch chain, his carefully arranged sitting room, and she felt the cold, furious thing in her chest that she'd felt at the kitchen table on the morning he came with the papers. But she kept her face still. "I'll pass along what you've said," she said. "Please do." He nodded toward the door, and one of the men appeared to escort her out. She was almost to the front door when Crow said behind her, "Mrs. Rourke." She stopped but didn't turn. "I've found that when a man won't listen to reason, it's sometimes easier to reach him through the people he cares about. I hope it doesn't come to that." She walked out without answering. She was halfway down the main street, moving quickly, when she heard the sound of a horse coming hard and fast from the direction of the northern road. She turned. Gideon pulled up beside her, his horse breathing hard, his face set in an expression she hadn't seen before, controlled but barely, the way a fire is controlled by the narrowness of the hearth. He looked at her. He looked at the estate behind her. He looked back at her. "Get on," he said. "I can manage my own." Tessa, just her name. The way he said it, not commanding, not angry, something more than either made her stop. "Please get on the horse." She got on the horse. They were out of town before either of them spoke. Then Gideon said, with his eyes on the road ahead, "Amos sent a man down when he saw you leave. I should have known you'd come here. I found something in the records office," she said. She told him. The altered document, the mismatched notary date, the figures that confirmed what her almanac had suggested. She told him about Crow's sitting room, word for word, including the last thing he'd said. Gideon was very quiet. When she finished, he said, "He threatened you." "He threatened my father," she said, which is effectively the same thing. "No," Gideon said, and his voice was flat and heavy in a way she hadn't heard before. "It's worse. Your father is on flat ground. You're up the mountain." She thought about that. "He underestimates us," she said. Gideon glanced at her. "Explain." "He thinks I went to that records office because I'm scared," she said. "He thinks he can use my father to turn me. He doesn't understand yet that I went to that records office because I'm building a case." She pressed her hand against the folded papers inside her coat. "And he just made a mistake in front of a witness." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "What kind of case?" he said. "Kind," she said. "That needs more than just us to bring it." He didn't answer, but she felt something change in the way he was sitting on the horse, a slight loosening of the set of his shoulders, a breath released. When they reached the ridge, an ironwood ridge came into view the house, the yard, the mountain rising behind it in the failing light. Tessa looked at it differently than she had on that first evening. She was starting to understand it, not just as a place, but as what it represented. What it had cost, what it was still worth protecting. She was also starting to understand something about the man riding beside her. He had built this place out of love, lost the people he built it for, and stayed anyway because leaving would have meant the love was only about the people and not also about what you build and protect and keep. He'd stayed on this mountain for years in a silence that the town had read as menace and was actually something much more human. He was a man who didn't know how to leave behind what mattered to him. She was starting to think that was not a flaw. That night she sat at the kitchen table with her almanac and the papers from the records office and the bank letter from the kitchen drawer, and she began to put it all together in a way that made sense. Gideon sat across from her without being asked and read what she showed him and added what he knew. And Amos, who had come in for a late dinner, pushed his plate aside and leaned over the table with them. It was the first time the three of them had sat like that together, working toward the same thing. The lamp threw its circle of light across the table. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Bishop put his graying head on Tessa's knee, and she scratched his ear without looking away from the papers. They worked until the lamp ran low. They were not going to let Alistair Crow take this mountain. Not the land. Not the memory of what had been built on it. And not the two people who were still, slowly and imperfectly, and without any poetry at all, figuring out how to stay. The papers they'd spread across the kitchen table that night became the foundation of everything that followed, and the reason everything nearly fell apart. Tessa spent the next 4 days organizing what they had into something that could be handed to another person and understood without explanation. She was methodical about it, in the way she was methodical about everything working from the outside in, establishing the frame before filling the middle. The altered loan document was the clearest piece. The mismatched notary date was the kind of thing a careful lawyer would catch immediately, and a careless one would miss entirely, which told her something about the quality of legal help Crow was used to dealing with in Red Hollow. He'd gotten comfortable. He'd operated in this county for long enough that he'd stopped worrying about being caught, because nobody had ever been in a position to catch him. That was going to be a problem for him. Gideon watched her work without interrupting. He brought coffee when the pot was full and took it away when it needed refilling, and twice she looked up from the table to find him reading over her shoulder, not checking her work. She realized, just reading, just absorbing it. He had a precise mind that he'd spent years directing entirely toward timber operations and survival, and she could see him now redirecting it toward this, fitting pieces together in a way that matched hers, but came from a different angle. On the fourth evening, he said, "Amos needs to know all of it." She looked up. "Does he?" "He knows more than he's told us," Gideon said. He said it without accusation, just as a fact. "I've known Amos 12 years. There's something he's been sitting on. She thought about Amos at the table, those careful eyes, the way he measured every sentence before he released it. She thought about what he'd told her about Edwin going up the mountain with supplies, and how he'd told her only what she needed to know, and nothing more. "How do you want to handle it?" she said. "Ask him straight," Gideon said. "That's the only thing that works with Amos." So the next morning, Gideon went to the timber yard and came back with Amos before the first shift started, and the three of them sat at the kitchen table, and Gideon said, "Without preamble, what do you know about the federal investigation?" Amos was quiet for a full 10 seconds. He was looking at the table, at the papers spread across it, at Tessa's organized columns of figures. Then he looked at Gideon. "How long have you known?" Amos said. "I didn't," Gideon said, "until just now." Amos let out a breath that seemed to carry something heavy with it. He put his hands flat on the table. Large hands, scarred in different places than Gideon's, from different kinds of work. He looked at those hands for a moment. "There's a federal marshal," he said. "Name of Garrett Cole. He came through the county seat 8 months ago, asking questions about land seizures and fraudulent debt collection. 5 families had filed complaints not just here, in 3 other counties too. Crow's been running the same scheme in a wider territory than anyone realized." He paused. "Cole came to me because I used to work with a man who'd filed one of the complaints. He knew I'd been on Ironwood Ridge long enough to have seen things." "What did you give him?" Tessa said. Amos looked at her. "Not enough. What I had was observation things I'd seen and heard over the years that pointed the right direction, but didn't prove anything. Cole said he needed documentation, bank records, original loan documents, something that showed the alteration directly." He nodded at the papers. "Something like what you have there." Tessa looked at Gideon. He was watching Amos with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite understanding, something balanced between them. "You should have told me," Gideon said. "I know," Amos said. 12 years, Amos, I know." He met Gideon's eyes. "I was trying to protect you from having to be in the middle of it." After everything, he stopped, looked at the table again. "I thought if I could handle it quietly, get Cole what he needed without pulling Ironwood Ridge into a federal investigation, that was better for you." "That wasn't your decision to make," Gideon said. "No," Amos said. "It wasn't. The silence that followed was the kind between men who have trusted each other for a long time, and hit the first real fracture in that trust, where the fracture is real, but so is everything underneath it." Tessa said, "Can you get a message to Cole?" Both men looked at her. "If he's building a case, and we have documentation that fills his evidentiary gap," she said, "then we need to get it to him before Crow figures out what we're holding. Once Crow knows we have the altered document, he's going to move. He's already told us that." She looked at Amos. "How do you reach Cole?" "Post rider," Amos said. "There's a man in the county seat who passes messages. Takes 3 days to get a response. Then we start today," she said. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at her with that particular expression. She'd come to recognize the one where he was assessing something and finding it matched what he'd expected, but the expectation itself still surprised him. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said, and went to find paper. She wrote the letter herself, because her handwriting was cleaner than either of theirs, and because she'd developed, in the past weeks, precise vocabulary for what they'd found. She laid out the documentation in order: the original loan figure, the altered penalty clause, the notary date discrepancy, the secondary figures in the supply invoice, the county land records that showed Lester's signature on 3 separate property transfers that shouldn't have involved him. She was careful not to overstate anything. Overstatement gave lawyers room to dismiss. Precision didn't. Amos took the letter that afternoon. Then they waited. Waiting, Tessa discovered, was its own kind of work. Not passive waiting with stakes is an active grinding process that operates just below the surface of everything you do. She cooked meals and managed the house and helped Gideon understand the figures she'd assembled, and underneath all of it she was listening for horses on the road, watching for movement at the tree line, running through contingencies in her head. What if Cole didn't respond? What if he already had what he needed and didn't need theirs? What if Crow moved before the response came? On the 5th day of waiting, Gideon found her standing at the east window in the early morning dark before the household had properly started. "You need to sleep," he said. "I'm sleeping," she said. "You're not." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was in the doorway in his work clothes, his hair not yet fully tamed, his face with the particular open quality it only had early in the morning before he put the day's armor on. "If I sleep, I dream about Crow's sitting room," she said. "The window with the light arranged wrong. I'd rather just be awake." He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved to the window and stood beside her, looking out at the dark line of the trees. When Lydia was pregnant with Nell, he said, "She used to stand at this window before it was light. I'd wake up and she'd be gone and I'd know to look here." He paused. "I asked her once what she was thinking about, and she said she was listening to the mountain. I said, 'The mountain doesn't say anything,' and she said, 'You're not listening right.'" Tessa looked at him. He was looking at the trees, not her. "She sounds like she was smart," Tessa said. "Smarter than me," he said. "Most people are." She looked back out the window. The first gray hint of light was starting to separate the tree line from the sky. "I hear it," she said. "The mountain. I didn't the first night." "But now I do." He didn't answer that, but he stayed at the window. They stood there in the dark for a while, not talking, until the light came enough to start the day. The response from Marshal Cole arrived on the 7th day. Amos brought it up the mountain himself instead of sending it by rider, which told Tessa everything before she even opened it. "You came yourself when the news was significant enough to require a face." Cole wanted a meeting, not correspondence a meeting. He named a location in the county seat, a back room at a specific building she'd never heard of, and a date 6 days out. He also included a single line that made everything else real. He had been building this case for 8 months, and this was the first documentation he'd received that showed direct evidence of forgery. Gideon read the letter twice. He set it face down on the table. 6 days, he said. 6 days, Tessa agreed. "Crow will be watching the road by now," Gideon said. "He knew you were at the records office. He knows you found something." "He doesn't know what I found," she said. He guessed. "There's a difference. Not much of one if he decides to stop guessing and start acting," Amos said. She knew they were right. She'd been thinking about it since she'd walked out of Crow's sitting room. He'd been careful and patient for years, manufacturing debts slowly, moving on properties methodically, but there was a timeline driving him now. The corridor contracts had a decision date. If Ironwood Ridge was still in Gideon's hands when those contracts were awarded, Crow's position weakened significantly. He was not going to wait indefinitely. "We need to get to that meeting," she said. "I'll take you," Gideon said. He said it without discussion, without presenting it as something to decide. "That leaves Amos on the ridge alone," she said. "Amos has 12 men in the timber yard who'd argue differently," Amos said. "Go." They left before dawn 2 days later, enough time to make the county seat by the meeting date with a day to spare, traveling the long way around through the northern pass to avoid the main road where they were most visible. It added 4 hours to the journey. It was worth it. The ride was cold. Late autumn had settled in properly now, the kind of cold that sits in the air with weight, that gets into your collar and your gloves regardless of how well you've bundled. Tessa rode with the papers inside her coat against her body for warmth and protection both. They talked during the long stretches of road not about Crow, not about the meeting, but in the way that comes from spending hours on horseback with someone when there's nothing to do but move and be. Gideon told her about the timber operation, about how he'd built it from nothing after the mine collapse because he needed something to do with his hands or he would have come apart. She told him about the Vale Farm's better years, about her grandfather's original clearing work, about the apple orchard along the south fence that nobody had properly tended since her mother died. "What kind of apples?" he said. "Winesap, mostly, some Cortland," she paused. "My mother had a recipe for a spiced apple cake that she said came from her grandmother. She never wrote it down. I can approximate it, but it's not quite right. I can't get the spice balance. What's the memory taste like? He said. She looked at him. What? When you think of it, what does it taste like? She thought about it. Actually thought about it, not the recipe, but the memory. The kitchen warm, her mother's hands, the smell of the spices going into the bowl. Cardamom, she said finally. I always leave out the cardamom. I keep thinking it's not right, but I think it actually is. He nodded. Like this was useful information. She looked at him sideways. How do you know about memory tastes? You used to say food tasted different when it was made by someone who loved you, he said. She was 3. I don't know where she got it. Tessa was quiet for a moment. She was right, she said. He didn't answer, but the set of his shoulders was different than it had been 5 minutes before. The county seat was larger than Red Hollow, larger enough to be anonymous, which was exactly what they needed. They arrived late in the afternoon of the day before the meeting and took 2 rooms at the boarding house Amos had recommended, run by a woman named Hester Fole, who asked no questions and kept her own counsel, which was worth considerably more than her modest rates. Tessa sat in her room that evening and went through the papers one more time. She'd been through them so many times she could have recited them, but she went through them again because the act of organizing them settled something in her, made it real and graspable, made it something she could hold. There was a knock at the door. She opened it. Gideon. He had a plate in his hand, bread, dried meat, a small wedge of hard cheese. Hester said, "You hadn't come down for supper," he said. She stepped back from the door. He came in and set the plate on the small table by the window and stood there, slightly at a loss in the small room, the way a man his size is always slightly at a loss indoors. "Sit down," she said. "You're making the room feel smaller." He sat on the edge of the chair by the window. She sat on the bed because it was the only other option, and they were past awkwardness about that sort of thing by now. "Tell me about Cole," she said. "What Amos told you." Federal marshal appointed 2 years ago. Before that, he was a territorial deputy for 9 years in the northern counties. Amos says he's careful and he doesn't move until he's ready, which means when he moves, he tends to stick. He looked at his hands. He has a reputation for being hard to buy. Good, Tessa said. It also means if he decides what we have isn't enough, he'll say so and there's no going around him. It's enough, she said. He looked at her, not challenging, just checking. It's enough, she said again. The forgery on the loan document is direct and provable. Everything else supports it. I've done the math 7 times. All right, he said. She picked up a piece of the bread and tore it. She hadn't realized until that moment how hungry she was. What happens, she said, if Cole takes this and builds his case and it works? What does that look like for Ironwood Ridge? Gideon thought about it. The fraudulent loan on your father's property gets challenged. Could be voided entirely if the forgery is established. The land seizures Crow's done over the years, probably years of legal work to unwind, but it starts moving. He paused. Ironwood Ridge would be clear. No legal ties Crow could pull on. No manufactured debts. And the corridor, she said. Without Crow's bank backing one of the groups, the bidding changes. Whether somebody else buys my pass is still possible, but it becomes my decision. He said that last part quietly, like it was still something he was getting used to, the idea that his decisions about this land would be his again, fully. She looked at him. What would you do with it, if it was clear and free and completely yours? He was quiet for a long moment. I'd keep running timber, he said. I'd rebuild the section of the operation that's been struggling, because as I've had money going to legal consultations for 2 years instead of equipment. He paused. I'd fix the east end of the house. The roof there it's not right. The ceiling drips when it rains hard, she said. I put a bucket. I know, I saw the bucket. Something shifted in his face. I should have fixed it before you arrived. You had other things to think about, she said. He shook his head, slightly annoyed at himself. It shouldn't take something being wrong to make me notice. She thought that was probably true. She also thought it was the kind of admission that cost him something to make, and that the making of it was important. I'll fix it when we get back, he said. I know you will, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up and said good night, and she went back to the papers. And the night settled in around the boarding house with its particular city sounds, horses, voices, the creak of the building itself, and she slept better than she had in a week. Marshal Garrett Cole was not what she expected. She had built an image in her head over the past week, a large official man, formal, deliberate, with the specific energy of someone who held authority and knew it. What arrived at the back room of the county surveyor's office at 10 in the morning was a lean man in his 40s with a weathered face and a gray coat that had seen significant use, who shook Gideon's hand and then Tessa's with equal directness and sat down across the table and said, "Show me what you've got." So she showed him. She laid it out the way she'd organized it, frame first, then the fill. Original loan figure, altered clause, notary discrepancy, supporting documentation, county land records. She talked him through it without rushing and without over-explaining. Cole listened with his hands flat on the table and his eyes moving between her face and the papers with an attention that was absolute and gave nothing back. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the document with the altered penalty clause and looked at it closely. "You didn't remove this from the records office," he said. "I copied the relevant figures," she said. "The original document is still in the records office." "I don't have the authority to remove it." He looked at her. "You have a good memory for figures." "Yes," she said. "I do." He looked at Gideon. "And the bank letter? The arrangement document?" "Found in my house," Gideon said. "Kitchen drawer. It was given to me 14 months ago by a representative of Holloway Bank as confirmation of a business meeting I didn't end up attending. Kept it because," he paused. "I keep documents." "Good habit," Cole said. He gathered the papers into a neat stack and looked at them collectively for a moment. He had the particular quality of someone doing arithmetic in his head, not of numbers but of consequence, running through the weight of things against each other. "This fills a gap," he said finally. "A significant one." He looked at Tessa. "How did you know to look at the notary date specifically?" "The numbers were wrong," she said. "The total didn't match what the original interest schedule should have produced. When numbers are wrong and the contract seems to say otherwise, something was changed after signing. The notary date was the simplest place to check." Cole looked at her for a moment. "What's your background?" "I kept my family's accounts from the time I was 16, she said. "Before that, I watched my grandfather do it." Cole said. It was not dismissive. It was the sound of someone updating their assessment. He told them what he had. 8 months of documentation from 5 families in 3 counties, a pattern of debt manipulation, false fees, forged penalty clauses, and strategic property seizures, all roads leading back to Alistair Crowe and the Holloway Bank. What he'd been missing was a document that showed direct forgery rather than circumstantial manipulation. What Tessa had given him was a clear case for document examination, a date that didn't match, a penalty clause in different ink that an expert could confirm in a day. "I can move on this," Cole said. He said it simply, the way a man says something when he's been waiting to say it for a while. "I'll need to access the original in the records office. I'll need a sworn statement from each of you." "You'll have it," Tessa said. "There's a timing issue," Gideon said. Cole looked at him. "Crowe is watching Ironwood Ridge," Gideon said. "He knows Tessa was in the records office. He's operating on the assumption that she found something he threatened the Vale farm, which means he's already accelerating." He met Cole's eyes. "How long before you can move with warrants?" Cole considered this. "Once I have the document examination confirmed, 3 days. 4 at the outside. Crowe may not give us 4 days, Tessa said. "Then we make it 3, Cole said. He said it without drama, without reassurance, just as a problem to solve and a timeline to meet. They gave their sworn statements that afternoon. Cole sent a rider to the records office before they'd even finished. He was not a man who wasted the time between decisions. The ride back to Ironwood Ridge was faster than the journey out. They took the main road because speed mattered more than caution now, and because Crow watching the road was actually useful information. If he saw them coming back empty-handed, he might hold. If he suspected they'd met with someone official, he might not. Tessa kept her face neutral on the main road through Red Hollow. She looked straight ahead. She did not look toward Crow's estate. She felt the urge to and refused it, because looking told people things. Gideon beside her said nothing. He was doing the same thing she was, projecting an ordinary afternoon. Two people returning from an errand. Nothing of consequence. He was better at it than her. He'd had more practice being looked at and not showing what was underneath. They were 3 miles past Red Hollow when she heard the horse coming behind them. Not fast, not pursuit, but deliberate. She didn't turn. "One rider," Gideon said quietly. "I hear it." The rider came alongside and she looked then. A young man, maybe 17, red-cheeked from the cold, wearing no coat she recognized, pulled his horse even with theirs and said, "Mr. Rourke, there's a message at the timber yard from a man named Lester." Gideon's hands tightened on the reins, just slightly. "From Lester," he said. "Yes, sir. He said to tell you, and he said I should say it exact. He said the arrangement is moving ahead of schedule, and you should know that before you get home." Tessa and Gideon looked at each other. Lester worked for the county land office. Lester's signature was on 3 of the fraudulent property transfers she'd documented for Cole. Lester sending a warning unprompted, through a neutral messenger, meant one of 2 things. Either he'd decided to get ahead of the investigation and was signaling that he'd cooperate, or he was genuinely warning Gideon that Crow was making a move. "Thank you," Gideon said to the boy. He pressed a coin into his hand and the boy turned back toward town. They rode hard the last miles. When Ironwood Ridge came into sight, Tessa saw it before she could process it. Horses at the timber yard. Multiple horses, and not the horses of Gideon's workers, who she'd learned by sight over the past weeks. Amos was standing at the yard gate. He looked at them when they rode in, and his face had the tight, controlled expression of a man who has been managing a bad situation by himself for several hours. "Came at noon," Amos said. "Crow, with 4 men and a lawyer." "A lawyer," Gideon said. "Served papers." Amos reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Emergency injunction. Claims the marriage created a joint debt situation with the Vale foreclosure and that Ironwood Ridge is now collateral." Tessa reached out and took the papers from Amos. She opened them. She read them. Her hands were not shaking. She was noting this about herself with some distant, precise part of her mind. Her hands were not shaking. The legal language was dense and deliberately complicated, the kind of document designed to overwhelm rather than explain. But the core of it was clear. Crow had found a lawyer willing to argue that because Tessa was a named party to the Vale debt and was now married to Gideon, there existed a legal bridge between the properties. He was claiming that any settlement of the Vale debt, including the original marriage arrangement, constituted a transfer of liability. It was creative. It was also, she thought, almost certainly not going to hold under serious legal examination. But serious legal examination took time, and an emergency injunction froze the timber operation pending review, freezing them out. "He can't actually do this," she said. "He can do it long enough," Gideon said. He was reading the papers over her shoulder. "The operation can't sit frozen," Amos said. "Men have wages. The equipment contracts have deadlines. 3 weeks of shutdown, and we start defaulting on things Crow didn't have to manufacture." Tessa lowered the papers. She stood very still for a moment. She had made a mistake. Not a catastrophic one. She had given Cole what he needed. She had done that, but she had underestimated how quickly Crow would move once he sensed threat. She'd been thinking about this as a race to build a case. Crow had been thinking about it as a race to create enough legal chaos that the case didn't matter. She looked at Gideon. "Cole needs to move faster than 3 days," she said. "Cole doesn't know about this yet," Gideon said. "Then we need to tell him." "That's a day's ride," Amos said. "Then I leave tonight," Tessa said. Both men looked at her. "I know the route," she said. I know the papers, and I know how to explain them to Cole faster than either of you. And if I ride tonight, I can reach the county seat by morning and be in front of Cole before noon tomorrow." Gideon said, "You're not riding that road alone at night." "Then come with me," she said. "One of us has to stay here," he said. "Amos can't hold this alone." She knew he was right. She also knew that the particular look on his face, the jaw set, the eyes hard, was not the face of a man who was comfortable with the arrangement he was about to agree to. "I'm not delicate," she said. "You already know that." "I know you're not delicate," he said. "That's not the—" He stopped himself. "Take Bishop." She looked at the old gray dog sitting at the yard gate watching them. "Bishop is 13 years old," she said. "He knows that road better than either of us, and he's louder than a gun going off at 3 in the morning," Gideon said. "Take him." She looked at him for a long moment, at the thing behind his eyes that he wasn't saying, that she could see anyway. That was about more than tactics and routes. "I'll be back by tomorrow night," she said. He gave her a single nod. She rode out as the sun was going down. Bishop trotted beside the horse with the determined, slightly arthritic dignity of an old dog who has been told he is needed and has taken the assignment seriously. The road at night was cold and long and intermittently frightening in the way empty roads are frightening, not because anything was there, but because of the width of the dark around you and the particular quality of the sounds it made. She kept her breathing steady and her pace consistent, and she thought about the papers inside her coat and what she was going to say to Cole in the morning. She was 2 hours down the mountain when she heard the other horses. Not one this time, 3 at least, coming up from the south on a line that would intersect hers in less than a quarter mile. Pulled her horse off the road into the tree line and stopped. Bishop went completely silent. He pressed his body against her horse's leg, which she'd once thought was an old dog's instinct to shelter, but which she now understood was tactical. He was hiding too. The riders passed on the road below her position. 3 men riding fast heading up toward Ironwood Ridge. She recognized, in the moonlight, the coat of the man in front. Crow did not wait for daylight. She sat in the dark of the tree line for 30 seconds, which was exactly as long as she could afford to sit. Then she turned her horse back toward the mountain road, because Cole could wait, and Ironwood Ridge could not, and she rode back up the way she'd come with Bishop, running hard beside her, and the cold air burning in her lungs. When Ironwood Ridge came into view, she saw a light in the windows. Not lamplight, too orange, too broad, moving in the way of something that was not contained. The upper section of the house was on fire. She came into the yard at a hard run, and she could hear, over the sound of her own horse and the roaring in her ears, the crack and report of a rifle from somewhere in the timber yard. Another from the porch. A man she didn't recognize was between the barn and the house, and she came off the horse before it fully stopped, and she ran because there was no calculation to do anymore, only motion. She reached the porch door, and it opened from the inside before she touched it, and Amos was there, rifle in hand, his face cut somewhere above the eyebrow, blood tracking down his cheek. 3 of them came through the east yard, he said quickly. Gideon's in the timber, he's driving them back. There's 1 more somewhere. I saw Crow on the road, she said. He came from the south. Amos's face changed. He's already inside, Amos said. She pushed past him into the house. The upper floor was burning. She could smell it, feel the heat coming down through the ceiling, hear the particular awful voice of wood taking fire. The smoke was not yet thick on the lower level, but it was coming. She moved through the hall, through the front room, and stopped. Crow was in the front room. He had a revolver. He was holding it with the calm of a man who had decided finally to stop being patient. He looked at her, and for just a moment, something crossed his face that was not triumph. Something closer to regret, not the regret of having done wrong, but the regret of a man who had wanted this to go differently and now had to deal with the version that didn't. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. She looked at the revolver. She looked at his face. She looked at the door behind her that was still open. She said, "You're going to lose everything you've built." He almost smiled. "I have the ridge," he said. "The injunction." The injunction is based on forged documents, she said. There's a federal marshal in the county seat with a sworn statement and a document examiner already working. You have days, maybe less. The almost smile faded. You're bluffing, he said. Then why did you ride up here in the middle of the night with 3 men and set my house on fire, she said. He raised the revolver. The front door came off its hinges. Gideon came through it the way a man comes through something he doesn't have time to open, and the sound it made was enormous in the room. And Crow turned, and Tessa moved because moving was the only option, and the revolver fired into the wall exactly where she had been standing. Crow had 1 shot, and he'd missed. Gideon had a rifle, and he leveled it, and the room went completely still. The fire above them was not still. It was moving, spreading, the sound of it filling the upper house like something alive and hungry and getting worse. It's over, Crow, Gideon said. His voice was absolutely level. Crow looked at the rifle. He looked at Tessa. He looked at Gideon. And for the first time she saw the thing behind Crow's eyes that he'd always kept perfectly managed. Fear, actual human fear, the kind that comes when you finally run out of moves. It's over, Gideon said again. Crow lowered his revolver. Amos was in the doorway with his own rifle, and outside the sound of the remaining men in the yard had gone quiet in the particular way that meant they were either down or gone. The ceiling groaned. We need to get out, Tessa said. She said it quietly to Gideon now. He looked at her. He looked at the burning ceiling. He looked at Crow. Move, he said to Crow. And they went out into the cold night air. All of them, with the upper house burning orange against the black sky behind them. And Tessa stood in the yard and watched a section of the roof she'd learned to love cave in on itself, in a shower of sparks. And she thought about the tin horse on the windowsill in the locked room, and whether it had survived. And she pressed her hand against the papers inside her coat, and she did not cry, because she was saving it for when it would be useful. Amos fired a signal shot into the air. 3 minutes later they heard horses on the mountain road. Not Crow's men. The timber yard workers, coming from the bunkhouse at the edge of the property, alerted by the signal the way Amos had clearly arranged earlier. And beneath the sound of horses and the burning house and the cold mountain wind, she heard something else. A rider coming up the southern road, fast, she turned. The rider wore a gray coat she recognized. Marshal Garrett Cole. He hadn't waited for morning. He pulled his horse up in the yard and looked at the burning house, and at Crow, standing between Gideon's rifle and Amos's, and he looked at Tessa, standing in the yard with her hand pressed to her chest where the papers were. He looked at Crow. Alistair Crow, he said. Federal warrant. Fraud, extortion, illegal seizure, conspiracy. He looked at the burning house. And I suspect we're going to add a few more before morning. Crow stood very still. Then, as if his body had simply run out of the posture that had held him upright for years, his shoulders dropped an inch. Cole dismounted. Tessa looked at Gideon. He was watching the house burn with the particular face of a man standing in front of something irreplaceable, calculating what was lost and what was not. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright, but not with tears, with the particular bright of someone who is holding a very large weight and choosing to hold it. She walked to him and stood beside him. The room, she said. He looked at her. The tin horse, she said, I'm sorry. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the photograph was on the first floor. The main bedroom, I moved it last week. He paused. I don't know why, I just moved it. She looked at him. That's why, she said. He didn't answer. But he reached out and put his hand on her shoulder, not pulling her toward him, just placing it there, the weight of it, and she didn't move away. And they stood like that together in the yard of Ironwood Ridge and watched the fire burn down to something that could be rebuilt. The fire burned through the rest of that night. Not all of the house Cole's arrival had brought enough hands to contain it. The timber yard workers forming a line from the well, hauling water in whatever they could carry. They saved the first floor, the kitchen, the east wing. The upper story was gone, and the roof above the main bedroom would need to come down entirely before anything could be rebuilt on top of it. But the walls were standing. The foundation was intact. The house was damaged in the way that things can be damaged and still be repaired, which was different from destroyed, and that difference mattered. Tessa didn't sleep that night, neither did Gideon. They stood in the yard while the workers finished with the water, and while Cole's men secured Crow and his remaining gunmen, and then they walked through what was left of the lower floor together with a lamp, cataloging what was salvageable. She had learned by now that this was how Gideon handled shock, by moving directly to the practical, by finding the next thing that needed doing and doing it. She understood that because she operated the same way. The kitchen was intact. The front room had smoke damage along the ceiling in one wall, but the furniture was mostly usable. The main bedroom where Gideon had moved Lydia's photograph the week before, for reasons he still hadn't fully explained to himself, had a cracked window and soot on every surface, but was structurally whole. He picked up the photograph from the dresser. The glass was intact. He turned it over in his hands twice, checking the frame, and then set it back against the wall. He stood there looking at it for a moment. "They're still here," Tessa said. Quietly from the doorway, he didn't answer right away. Then, yes, she left him there and went back to the kitchen to make coffee because there were federal officers in the yard who had ridden hard and done good work, and the least she could do was give them something hot. Cole came inside around 4 in the morning, gray coat still buttoned, looking like a man who was accustomed to long nights and had made peace with that fact years ago. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee with a nod and looked at Tessa with the same direct assessment he'd used when she laid the papers out in front of him. "Crow will be transported to the county seat at first light," he said. "His men," she said. "2 in custody. 1 man will have him by morning." He paused. "The lawyer who filed the injunction is going to have a difficult conversation with the territorial court this week. The injunction itself? Consider it withdrawn," Cole said. "By circumstances, if not by paperwork." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. It was chipped, she'd noticed that weeks ago, and kept meaning to replace it, and now it felt significant somehow, the specific familiar chip on the rim of a cup she'd been using long enough to know by feel. "There are other families," she said. "I know," Cole said. "Beyond what I documented, Crow has been running this scheme for years across multiple counties. Those families deserve Mrs. Rourke." He said it without cutting her off, just gently interrupting. "I know. That is exactly why I've been building this case for 8 months. Your documentation," he said it with a particular weight, "the weight of something that has been waited for, gives me what I need to open the full investigation. Not just the Red Hollow cases, all of it." She looked at him. "How long to unwind all of it?" "Years." He didn't soften this. "The courts move slowly and Crow's lawyers won't. But the fraudulent seizures, those will be challenged directly, and the families, in clearest cases of forgery, should see resolution within 12 to 18 months. It was less than she wanted and more than she'd had yesterday. She filed it in the part of her mind that managed expectations and moved on. Gideon came into the kitchen. He looked at Cole and then at Tessa, and then he sat down at the table and she put a cup in front of him. "What do you need from us going forward?" Gideon asked Cole. "Your continued cooperation with the investigation. The sworn statements you gave will be central to the case. There may be a formal deposition later. I'll give you advance notice." Cole looked at them both. "I also want you to understand that Crow's network doesn't disappear because he's in custody. He has associates, men who've benefited from his arrangements, who are going to feel the pressure of this investigation and react in ways we can't entirely predict." "Meaning we're not finished being careful," Tessa said. "Meaning exactly that," Cole said. He left before sunrise, riding out with Crow in irons and 2 deputies flanking the wagon, the first gray light just starting to come up over the eastern ridge. Tessa stood on the porch and watched them go and felt something she hadn't expected, not triumph, not relief, but something quieter and more complicated. the feeling of a long-held breath being slowly, carefully released. The days immediately after were difficult in a way she hadn't anticipated. The danger was gone, or at least the most immediate version of it, but what followed was not peace. What followed was exhaustion and damage assessment, and the particular grinding work of figuring out what comes next when the crisis that has been organizing your every thought and action is suddenly, partially over. The upper story of the house couldn't wait. The structural integrity of what remained was compromised, and the first good rainstorm, which in the mountains, in late autumn, was never more than a week away, would make it worse. Gideon assessed it the morning after the fire with the timber yard senior builder, a quiet man named Cal, who walked the perimeter, climbed a ladder to examine the remaining walls, and delivered his verdict without decoration. Tear down what's burned, shore up the supports, rebuild from the floor up. How long? Gideon asked. With the right crew and no more snow than usual, Cal said. Weeks? Maybe 8? Do it, Gideon said. Amos organized the timber yard workers for the demolition. Tessa managed the household, which now consisted of herself, Gideon, and whatever floor space they could keep clear of debris and construction equipment. She moved her things into the kitchen area because it was the most intact room, and Gideon took the east wing room. And for a week they lived in that compressed way that disaster forces on people closer together by necessity, working around each other in the literal sense, learning the geography of each other's habits and rhythms in far more detail than any normal arrangement would have required. She learned that he woke at 4:30 regardless of what had happened the day before. She learned that he read in the evenings not novels, technical manuals, and land surveys, but he read with the same absorbed intensity she'd have expected from fiction. She learned that when he was tired but not ready to acknowledge it, he went and sat with Bishop in the barn, which she suspected he'd been doing for years, and which the old dog clearly considered a regular and important appointment. He learned things about her too, she knew. She was not. Under normal circumstances, a person who showed much she'd trained that out of herself early, the visible reaction, the readable face, but you couldn't live in compressed quarters with someone, sharing the kitchen and the single intact fireplace and the dog, without that training slipping in the small hours. He saw her, she knew, when she sat at the table late at night, going over the paperwork from Cole's investigation, working through the list of affected families, writing up her own accounting of each case's specifics. He saw her when the numbers wouldn't resolve, and her jaw tightened, and she pressed the heels of both hands against the table and breathed through it. He didn't say anything about it. He brought coffee. That was how he was. He didn't name the thing. He just addressed it. 8 days after the fire, a letter came from Red Hollow. It was from the wife of one of the families Tessa had included in her documentation for Cole, a woman named Ruth Calloway, whose husband had lost their dairy farm to a fraudulent debt seizure 16 months ago. The letter was short and not particularly well written, and was absolutely devastating in its plainness. Her husband Walt had been working as a laborer, for the man Crow had sold their farm to, on the land Walt had cleared himself, for wages that didn't cover what they'd had before. She said she'd heard that Crow had been arrested. She said she didn't know if that meant they'd get the farm back, but she wanted Tessa to know that they were praying. Then she crossed out praying and wrote thinking of you, and below that added, "We heard what you did." Thank you. Tessa read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the almanac, behind her figures. Gideon was at the other end of the table. He'd seen her face change. "Good news or bad?" he said. "Neither," she said. "Both." She paused. "There's a woman in Red Hollow who crossed out the word praying in a letter because she didn't know if I'd find it offensive and wrote thinking of you instead." He was quiet for a moment then. "That's a kind person." "It is," she said. She thought about the Calloway farm. She thought about Walt Calloway working his own land for someone else's wages. She thought about all the crossed-out words in all the letters that hadn't been written yet. "This isn't done," she said. not to Gideon specifically. Just out loud. No, he said. It's not. When Cole's investigation moves, when the cases start going to court, those families are going to need someone to organize the testimony. To make sure the documentation is coherent, that the individual cases connect to the pattern. She looked at Gideon. I want to do that. He looked at her. He was reading her the way he read land surveys, looking for the grain, the load points. That puts you back in front of Crow's lawyers, he said.
Yes.
And Cole said his associates are still… Yes, she said again. A long pause. All right, he said. She looked at him. That's it? All right. What did you want me to say? I don't know. An argument, maybe. A concern. I have concerns, he said. You're going to be visible in a legal fight against men who have already set our house on fire. That's a real concern. He put both hands flat on the table. But you're going to do it regardless of what I say, and the choice between doing it with my support or without it doesn't change whether you do it. It just changes whether you have to do it alone. She stared at him. He looked slightly uncomfortable under the stare, the way he got when he felt he'd said more than was necessary. I'm not saying anything special, he said. I'm just… You're not, she said. You're saying something. She looked at the table. My father he was never able to. She stopped. Restarted. Nobody has said that to me before. That version of it. Gideon was quiet. Well, he said finally, you've never had someone say it before because you've never had someone to say it. He said it matter-of-factly, without sentiment. That's different from it not being true. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the courthouse, the signed papers, the drive up the mountain in silence. She thought about how far that morning was from this one, and how the distance was not measurable in time. The construction on the upper story was 2 weeks in when Amos came to the kitchen early on a Thursday morning with a particular look on his face, the look that meant he'd been holding something and had decided it was time to put it down. He sat across from Tessa, and he didn't take the coffee she pushed toward him right away. I have something to tell you both, he said, and I should have told you sooner, but I was working out how. Gideon came in from outside and stopped when he saw Amos's face. He sat down. Marshal Cole came to me yesterday, Amos said. The yard, he came privately, not officially. He paused. Crow's hearing has been moved up. The territorial court has a window next week, and they're using it. Cole says the case is strong enough to proceed. That's faster than expected, Tessa said. Yes, Amos said. But that's not what I needed to tell you. He looked at his hands. The careful eyes. Cole told me that in the course of securing Crow's financial records, they found a secondary set of accounts. Not for the land scheme, for something else. He looked at Gideon. For the mine. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water, and the silence that spread from it was total. Gideon's face had gone very still. What about the mine, he said. His voice was level, completely, carefully level. The structural collapse, Amos said. It wasn't purely accidental. He said it quietly, but without hedging. Crow's bank held the insurance policy on the mine operation. There was a clause, a significant payout clause, that triggered on catastrophic structural failure. Cole found payments in the secondary accounts, predating the collapse, to a man who was responsible for the structural inspections. The kitchen was entirely silent, except for the sound of the construction above them, which felt suddenly very wrong to have as background noise. Gideon said he knew. The investigation is ongoing, Amos said. Cole said it's not confirmed yet. There's still work to do to prove it definitively. But the evidence is… He stopped. He knew, Gideon said again. Tessa looked at him. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before, not the controlled stillness she'd come to read as his version of holding something difficult, but something beneath that. Something that had been buried for a very long time underneath layers of grief and survival, something that now had a shape it hadn't had before. Lydia and Nell had not died because the mountain failed. They had died because a man in a clean suit had decided their lives were worth less than an insurance payout. She reached across the table and put her hand over Gideon's. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that would have been adequate, and she knew that, and she didn't try. She just put her hand there and kept it there. His jaw worked. He looked at the table. He breathed slowly in and out. Then he said very quietly, "I want to be in that courtroom." "You will be," Amos said. Cole said, "You have the right." As a witness, and as he said, "You have the right." Gideon looked at Tessa. She looked back at him. There were things passing between them in that look that neither of them was going to say in front of Amos, not because they were private exactly, but because they hadn't been said yet between themselves. And saying them here first would have been wrong. "Okay," she said. "Just that." He nodded once. Amos finally picked up his coffee. The hearing date was set for 10 days out. Tessa spent those 10 days doing two things simultaneously: organizing the documentation for Cole's broader fraud case, cataloging and cross-referencing each family's situation with the care of someone who understood that clarity was mercy in legal proceedings, and helping Gideon prepare his own testimony about the mine. That second task was harder. Not because he was unwilling, he was. She came to understand, almost relieved to do it, the way a wound you've been carrying heals differently once the pressure is finally released. But because the act of putting it into words, in order, in the precise chronological sequence that legal testimony requires, meant going back through every piece of it. The morning of the collapse, what he'd been doing. When he'd heard it, the running, the impossibility of the running. He told it to her first, at the kitchen table, late at night when the construction workers had gone to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet. He told it in the flat, careful voice of someone who has been keeping a thing intact through sheer force of containment. And she listened without interrupting and without the particular kind of sympathetic sounds that would have pulled him out of it prematurely. When he finished, he sat for a long moment with his hands flat on the table. "Was that enough?" he said. "For the testimony. It's more than enough," she said. "It's everything Cole will need." He nodded. He looked at the table. Then he said, in a different voice, quieter, less prepared. "I've never said all of it out loud before." "In that order." "I know," she said. "It's different," he said. Saying it out loud. "Does it feel worse?" He thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "It feels like it has edges now. Before it was just everywhere." He stopped. "That probably doesn't make sense." "It makes sense," she said. He looked at her. That look that she had come to know the reading one, the one that checked whether what he'd expected matched what was actually there. "You've done this before," he said. "Put something into words so it has edges." "I do it with numbers," she said. "Same principle." The corner of his mouth moved. "I don't know how to do it with numbers." "I don't know how to do it without them," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then between us we've got one complete person." She stared at him. Then she made that sound again, the one that was half breath and half something else, and she pressed her hand over her mouth for a second, and when she took it away, she was trying very hard not to fully smile and failing. "That's possibly the most honest thing you've ever said," she told him. "I have my moments," he said. They went to the county seat for the hearing. Amos stayed at the ridge with the construction crew. Bishop came with them because he'd apparently decided, after the night of the fire, that wherever Tessa went he was going too. And arguing with a 13-year-old dog about his travel arrangements was a battle nobody had the energy for. The courthouse in the county seat was considerably larger than the one in Red Hollow, built to hold a community's official life, with high windows and wooden benches worn smooth by years of use. It smelled like old paper and boot leather and the particular cold that accumulates in large official buildings regardless of the fire in the corner. Crow was already there when they arrived. He sat at the defendant's table in a clean coat that someone had evidently brought from his house, and he looked smaller than he had in his own sitting room. Not diminished, not yet, but compressed somehow, the architecture of his authority removed. He looked like what he was, a man in his 50s who had done a great deal of damage and was now in a room specifically designed to make him account for it. He saw Gideon. He looked away first. Gideon noticed this. Tessa watched him notice it. He sat down in the gallery with the same stillness he brought to everything, but she could see in the line of his shoulder that the noticing had cost him something. Proceedings were not fast. Legal proceedings never were, and Tessa had long since accepted that the pace of official justice was its own kind of punishment, deliberate, grinding, full of language designed to slow everything down to a speed where all the exits could be examined. Crow's lawyers were good, as she'd expected. They questioned the chain of custody of the documentation. They raised procedural objections. They presented the injunction as a good-faith legal instrument rather than a weapon of economic warfare. Cole was better. He was the kind of man who had been doing this long enough to know that the other side's noise was just noise, and that the answer to noise was precision. He walked the judge through each document in sequence, established the chain of evidence, had the document examiner a small, meticulous woman named Doctor Edith Marsh, who wore her authority the way Cole wore his, quietly, and without needing to announce it, testify to the specific forensic evidence of the forgery. Dr. Marsh said, in the particular calm of expert testimony, that the penalty clause in the Vail loan document had been altered after signing. Different pen pressure, ink of slightly different composition. Microscopic evidence of the original text beneath the substituted language. Crow's lawyer objected. The judge overruled him. When it was Tessa's turn to testify, she walked to the stand and looked out at the courtroom. She saw Gideon in the third row. She saw Crow at the defendant's table. She saw the families, 8 of them had come. People she'd documented, but mostly not met in person. People whose farm names she'd written in her almanac, sitting in the gallery with the careful, exhausted attention of people who had been waiting a very long time for a room like this. She testified for 40 minutes. She answered every question Cole asked with the same precision she'd used when she laid the papers out in his office, and she answered every challenge from Crow's lawyer with the same steady refusal to be rattled that she'd been practicing, in one form or another, since she was 16 years old and keeping accounts in the back of an almanac because nobody else was going to. When Crow's lawyer tried to suggest that her figures were the amateur calculations of an untrained woman with a grudge against his client, she said, without raising her voice, the figures are accurate. The forensic examination has confirmed the core document. If the accuracy of my arithmetic is the question, I am happy to walk through each calculation in this courtroom for as long as necessary. We have time. The judge made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Crow's lawyer moved on. Gideon testified after her. He walked to the stand and he sat, and he gave his testimony in that careful, flat voice, and when he reached the part about the mine collapse, he did not look at Crow. He looked at the window. He said what had happened in the order it had happened, and he said it clearly and without performance, and the courtroom was very quiet while he did. When he was done, the judge asked him one question directly, departing from the formal procedure slightly, in a way that judges sometimes do when they need to understand something that the official record hasn't quite captured. "Mr. Rourke," the judge said, "in your understanding of the evidence presented today regarding the mine inspection records, do you believe the structural failure that claimed your wife and daughter's lives was preventable?" Crow's lawyer was on his feet with an objection before the judge had finished the sentence. The judge waved him back down. Gideon looked at the judge. "Yes," he said. "I believe it was preventable." The room was quiet again. "Thank you," the judge said. "You may step down." Gideon walked back to his seat. He sat beside Tessa. He did not look at Crow as he passed him. He looked straight ahead. She put her hand on his forearm briefly. Not a gesture he'd expected. She could tell he went slightly still, the way he did when something surprised him. But he didn't pull away. The ruling didn't come that day. Legal proceedings don't work that way. The judge closed the hearing and said a ruling would be issued within the week on the fraud charges, and that the mine investigation would require additional proceedings as the evidence was still being developed. But as they were leaving, filing out through the gallery, past the families from Red Hollow and the other counties, Past Crow, still sitting at the defendant's table with his lawyers speaking in low, urgent voices beside him, Ruth Calloway stopped in the aisle. She was a small woman, 50-ish, with the particular look of someone who has worked outdoors her whole life and has the weathering to show for it. She looked at Tessa and she said, "You're the one who wrote up the figures." "Yes," Tessa said. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she reached out and took Tessa's hand in both of hers. Her hands were rough and warm, and she held on for a moment, in the way of someone who is trying to say something that doesn't have the right words yet. "Walt doesn't know how to thank people," she said. "He's working on it." "But I do," she released Tessa's hand. She nodded once, the way women of a certain generation nod when they mean something completely, a full-body acknowledgement, compressed into a single motion. Then she moved past into the aisle. Tessa stood there for a moment. Then she moved on. Outside the courthouse, on the steps, the families gathered in the cold air in that particular way of people who have just been through something together and are not yet sure what to do with themselves in the aftermath. There were low conversations, some embraces, one man crying into his hat in a way he was clearly hoping nobody was looking at, which meant everyone was politely looking elsewhere. Gideon stood slightly apart, the way he always stood in groups, the comfortable solitude of a man who had spent years with his own company. But this time 2 of the farmers came to him directly, men she didn't know. Older men with the specific posture of people who have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and they spoke to him quietly, and he listened and responded and shook both their hands. And she saw in his face, from where she was standing, something that was not exactly ease but was moving in that direction. She went to him when the farmers had moved on. "What did they say?" she said. "One of them, the man on the left, worked the northern mine for 2 years before the collapse," Gideon said. "He left 6 months before. He said he'd been carrying guilt about that for years. Thinking if he'd stayed, he might have, he stopped. He said seeing me today helped him put some of that down." She looked at him. "And the other?" "Offered me a fair price on timber for his barn rebuild," Gideon said. She made a sound. "There's the frontier for you, practical," he said. "Very," she said. They stood on the courthouse steps in the cold for a moment. The sky was the particular pale gray of late autumn, the kind that means snow is thinking about it but hasn't committed yet. "The ruling will go our way," she said. "You're confident about that?" "The evidence is clean. Cole is good. And Crow's lawyers spent more time on objections than on alternate explanations, which means they don't have alternate explanations." She looked at the courthouse door. "It'll take time to unwind all of it, but yes, I'm confident." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, when this is over, when the legal work settles, what do you want?" She looked at him. The question was simple, and it wasn't. "I want to fix the east roof," she said. He gave her a look. "I want to plant something on those 200 acres, she said. "Something that takes time to grow, because I intend to be here when it comes up." She paused. "I want my father to visit and not look like a man apologizing for existing. I want Amos to stop pretending he's not getting older. Because he is, and eventually he's going to need someone to take some of the weight of the yard." She stopped. He was watching her with that expression she'd come to think of as his real face, not the closed mountain man face that Red Hollow had spent years being afraid of, but the one underneath it, the one that was present and careful and paying attention. "And us," she said. The words came out more plainly than she'd intended. "I want to. I don't know what we are yet. I know what we started as, and I know it wasn't that anymore some time ago, and I don't know exactly when that happened, but I want to figure out what it becomes." Deliberately, not just by accident of circumstance. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say that for 3 weeks. "How was my version?" she said. "Accurate," he said. "Too many words." "That's fair," she said. He looked at the pale gray sky. He looked at the courthouse. He looked at her. "The 200 acres, he said. "What would you plant?" She thought about the south fence at the Vale farm, about her grandfather's rose, about the orchard that nobody had tended properly in 3 years. "Apple trees," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Lydia wanted apple trees on the ridge, he said. She talked about it for years. Never got them in the ground. He said it without grief, exactly with something more settled than grief. Grief that had been lived with long enough to find a shape it could stay in. She used to say you could tell a lot about a place by whether it had an orchard. She said orchards meant someone planned to stay. Tessa looked at him. Then we'll plant an orchard, she said. He nodded. Slowly. Not the single businesslike nod of agreement she'd seen him use 100 times in the past weeks. A different kind. The kind that means yes and also more than yes. I know the right rootstock for that altitude, he said. Of course you do, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. She was starting to love the almost smile that appeared when she said something that surprised the expression out of him. She was starting to keep count of them the way she kept count of figures in an almanac, each one a small and real thing. They went back to the boarding house that evening. Hester Fole, who had clearly been following the proceedings by way of whatever invisible information network small-town women maintained, had put a pitcher of hot cider on the table in the front room without being asked and disappeared with a tact that Tessa found deeply impressive. They sat by the fire, she and Gideon and Bishop settled at their feet and put his gray head on his paws with a sigh of complete contentment, and they talked for a long time. Not about the hearing, not about Crow, not about evidence or timelines or what came next. About other things, about the mine in its early years, before everything, when Gideon had worked alongside the men who'd worked for him and the mountain had been full of sound and purpose. About her mother's kitchen in the good years, before the grief took Edwin down. About small things that had nothing to do with anything except being human and alive and sitting beside another person in a warm room. She fell asleep in the chair. She woke with a blanket over her that had not been there before, and the fire banked down to coals, and Gideon gone to his room, and Bishop still at her feet. She sat for a moment in the quiet and the warmth. She thought, I came up that mountain in the back of a wagon, thinking I was going to survive this. That was the whole plan. Survive it and figure out the rest later. She looked at the banked fire, at Bishop, at the room that was ordinary and temporary and familiar enough now to feel like rest. She thought, I didn't know yet that survival was going to turn into something else. Something I didn't have a word for yet. She was working on finding one. The ruling came 4 days later, delivered by postwriter to the Rourke address at Ironwood Ridge in a sealed envelope that arrived on a Tuesday morning, while Tessa was in the kitchen, and Gideon was in the timber yard, and Amos was arguing with the construction crew about a beam angle on the rebuilt upper floor. Opened it herself because it was addressed to both of them, and she was the one standing there. She read it twice. Then she walked out to the timber yard in her kitchen apron, with the letter in her hand, and she found Gideon between 2 stacks of cut pine, talking to Cal about the construction schedule, and she held the letter out to him. He read it. He looked up. The veil debt, she said. Voided. The fraudulent penalty clause invalidates the entire foreclosure proceeding. My father keeps the farm, free and clear of any Crow-related claim. He looked at the letter again. The emergency injunction, she said. Dismissed with prejudice. Ironwood Ridge is it's yours. Fully no legal shadows. He was quiet. Gideon, she said. He looked at her. The mine investigation, she said. Cole has filed additional charges. They're going forward. His jaw tightened, then relaxed. Then he nodded that particular nod, the more than yes nod. All right, he said. His voice was rough with something she chose not to name so it could stay his. She looked at the letter, then at him. I'm going to go tell Amos, she said. All right, he said again. She was 3 steps away when he said her name. She turned. He was standing there in the timber yard between the stacks of pine, sawdust on his coat, and he looked at her with a directness that she'd grown accustomed to, but that still, each time, required something of her, some willingness to be seen that she was still learning to offer. Thank you, he said, just that. She looked at him. At the scarred jaw and the burned hands and the face that Red Hollow had decided was the face of something dangerous before it had ever given itself the chance to look properly. "We're not done yet," she said. "I know," he said. "Thank you, anyway." She turned and went to find Amos, and the letter crinkled in her hand as she walked, and above her, the construction crew was hammering the new roof into shape, board by board, in the cold mountain air. An ironwood ridge was standing. The new roof had been on for 3 months when the orchard rootstock arrived. Tessa was in the kitchen going through Cole's latest correspondence when she heard the wagon on the mountain road, the particular labored sound of a loaded vehicle negotiating the grade, the driver talking to his horses in the encouraging way that people talk to animals they are genuinely relying on. She set the papers down and went to the window. Pete, the same delivery driver from the Eastern Territory nursery, was navigating the last bend with the careful attention of a man who had made this trip before and remembered exactly where the road got difficult. Crates in the wagon bed were wrapped in damp burlap, 20 of them, each one containing something that was currently dormant and unremarkable and would take years to become what it was supposed to be. She went outside. Gideon was already there, coming from the timber yard, wiping his hands on a cloth. He looked at the wagon and then at Tessa and said nothing, but there was something in his face that she had learned to read a particular stillness that was different from his regular stillness. That meant something mattered. "You didn't tell me they were coming today," she said. "I wasn't sure of the exact day," he said. "I didn't want to say it until it was real." She looked at him. This was one of the things she understood about him now, the way he held good things at a slight distance until they arrived, the protection mechanism of a man who had learned that anticipated things sometimes didn't come. "It's real," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is. They planted the trees over 2 days, she and Gideon and Amos and Edwin, who had come up the mountain for the occasion, and who moved through the work with the quiet steadiness of a man 37 days. Sober Tessa knew the number because he had told her when she asked. And she had asked because she wanted him to know the number mattered to someone other than himself. The first tree went into the ground on a Tuesday morning, in the best position on the slope, the wine sap, chosen for that spot deliberately, because wine sap was the variety her grandfather had grown along the south fence of the Vale farm, and because Gideon had confirmed it was right for the altitude. She pressed the soil in around the root ball with both hands, and she thought, 7 years. 7 years was a long time. She had not yet been alive for 20 of them. But she understood, crouching in the cold spring mud of the 200 acres that bore her name in the county deed records, that the point of planting something with a 7-year timeline was not the waiting. The point was the statement that you intended to be here, that you had decided this was where you belonged, and you were putting down evidence of that decision in the ground. Gideon planted the tree beside hers. He tamped the soil with his boot steady, methodical, the way he did everything physical. He looked at the 2 trees, small and dormant and frankly unimpressive, and he said, "Lydia wanted apple trees up here." Tessa looked at him. "She talked about it for years," he said. She'd sketched out where she wanted them even, which slope. The spacing. He looked at the ground. "I kept saying next spring. And then there wasn't a next spring. She didn't try to make that smaller than it was." "Then we're finishing it," she said, not replacing what she wanted. "Finishing it." He looked at her. "She'd have wanted the orchard," Tessa said. "The orchard is getting planted. That part doesn't have to be sad." He was quiet for a moment, then, "No, it doesn't." Edwin came up beside them, shovel over his shoulder, and looked at the 2 trees. "Your grandfather would have put them closer together," he said to Tessa. "My grandfather would have been wrong," she said. "They need the spacing for the canopy." Edwin considered this. "Fair enough," he said, and went to dig the next hole. Gideon watched him go with an expression Tessa couldn't entirely decode, something between assessment and a kind of tentative warmth, the look of a man not yet certain he has permission to feel well disposed toward someone. "Trying," she said quietly. "I can see that," Gideon said. That's enough for now. Yes, he said, it is. The Crow sentencing came down 6 weeks after the orchard was planted. 12 years, fraud and extortion, and the mine charges combined, with the mine charges carrying the heaviest weight. Crow's lawyers appealed immediately. Cole had expected this and had built the case to withstand it, which it did. The appeal failed 8 months later, and the conviction held in every material detail. Gideon heard about the appeal's failure by post, and he read the letter at the kitchen table and set it face down and sat quietly for a moment. Then he said it held. It held, Tessa agreed. Good, he said. Just that. Good. She understood by now that the smallness of the word was not indifference. It was compression. A man who felt things deeply and had learned to contain them in small words because the full versions were too large for ordinary rooms. She put her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a while, and the letter stayed face down between them. And outside the spring was coming up properly through the timber yard, and the new roof was solid overhead, and the apple trees were beginning to push out the first cautious growth of their first real season. The news about her father reached her on a Thursday, not bad news, which was what her stomach assumed when Amos came to the kitchen with his particular message-carrying expression. Good news in the specific form of 63 days. Edwin was counting sober days, and he'd told Amos the number, which meant he wanted someone else to know it, which meant it was real to him in a way that required witness. She went down the mountain the following Saturday. He looked better. The word for it was not restored. She was done with the idea of restoration, which implied return to a previous state, and what she wanted for him was not the past but the future. He looked better in the forward direction, steadier, present in his own face in a way he hadn't been in years. She told him about the orchard, about the 200 acres in her name, about the wine sap in the position with the best southern exposure. She told him about Gideon ordering the rootstock without telling her because he needed it to be real before he said it out loud. Edwin listened with the particular attention of a man who has recently relearned how to listen. When she finished, he said, "Your grandfather would have." "I know," she said. "He would have liked Gideon," Edwin said. "He had a way of knowing which men were real." She thought about that. "Real how? Real the way timber is real," Edwin said. "Dense all the way through, not just on the outside." She looked at her father, at the man he was on his good days, the man who had driven a wagon up a mountain with supplies because somebody ought to act decently, who had pruned the orchard at 4 a.m. when he couldn't sleep because the love was there, even when everything else was falling apart. "Come up sometime," she said. "Come meet him properly." "Not courthouse properly, actually." "I will," Edwin said. She believed him. The pregnancy she discovered on a Wednesday morning in October, in the specific quiet of the house before Gideon came in from the yard. She sat with it alone for a full day, because some things need to be understood by one person before they can be shared with another. She wasn't afraid of his reaction. She was afraid of her own feelings, which were large and complicated and genuine, the warm, specific wanting of it, tangled with the knowledge of what he had lost, and what she would be asking him to risk again. She told him the following morning. Kitchen table. Coffee. The same place where most of the true things between them had happened. He went very still. She watched his face move through the stages of it, the stillness, then the thing beneath it, then the fear which arrived fully and honestly and without any attempt to hide it from her. "I know what you're afraid of," she said before he could speak. He looked at her, and "I'm not going to tell you not to be afraid," she said. "Fear makes sense. What happened makes sense of it. But I need you to hear me when I say that fear doesn't get to make this decision for us." She held his eyes. "I need you in this, not managing from a distance. Not protecting yourself by holding back, actually in it." His jaw worked. "What if he started? Then we face it," she said. "Together, the way we've faced everything else." "This is different," he said. "I know it is," she said. "I'm not pretending it isn't. I'm saying that different and impossible are not the same word." He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He breathed in and out, once slowly, the way a man breathes when he is making room for something large. Then he said, "I'm in it." His voice broke slightly on the last word. She pretended not to notice. She had learned when to look at a thing and when to look past it. "Good," she said. She reached across and squeezed his hand once and let go and picked up her coffee, and the morning moved on around them. And Bishop sighed from his spot near the stove with the complete contentment of a very old dog who has assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Edwin came up the mountain in April, the first time he'd been on Ironwood Ridge, carrying honey from his own hives and moving through the yard with the careful attention of a man entering a place he wants to understand. He and Gideon worked beside each other for most of the morning, without saying much, the way men of a certain type communicate through proximity and parallel effort rather than words. Tessa watched from the kitchen window and thought about what Amos had told her about Edwin and the wagon and the supplies, about the specific quiet decency of a man going up a mountain when everyone else was going the other direction. At the end of the morning, Edwin shook Gideon's hand and said, "You take care of my daughter." Gideon said, "Your daughter takes care of herself." Edwin looked at him for a moment. "I know, but you help." "Yes," Gideon said. "I do." Edwin nodded, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Clara arrived in October, fast and unscheduled and entirely on her own terms, which was the first indication of her character. The midwife made it in time. Gideon stayed in the room because Tessa told him to, and he did it with the white-knuckled presence of a man who is more frightened than he has been in years and has decided that his fear is not the most important thing in the room. He was right about that. When it was over and the midwife had done what midwives do, and the room had settled into its quieter version of itself, Gideon held the baby with the careful stiffness of someone relearning an instinct. He looked at her face. She looked back with the unfocused inventory of the newborn, taking stock of a world she'd just arrived in. Tessa watched him hold her. She watched the fear in his eyes make room for something else, not disappearing, not replaced, but shifting over to allow another thing to exist alongside it. She had thought about this moment many times during the 9 months prior, and she had imagined it various ways. But she had not imagined exactly this, the specific expression on his face when he looked at Clara, which was not happiness in any clean or simple version of that word, but something older and more honest, something that had come through a great deal of damage and arrived here anyway. He looked up and found Tessa watching him. "She's all right," he said. "Not steady." "She's all right," Tessa said. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right." He looked back at Clara with the expression of a man who is understanding in real time that he is allowed to have this, that the world has not made a mistake in giving it to him, that love offered again after catastrophic loss is not a betrayal of the first love, but an extension of it, proof that the capacity survived. They named her Clara, not for anyone, just because it fit the specific clarity of her expression, the way she had arrived already prepared to have opinions. Amos came up from the yard an hour later and stood in the doorway looking at the baby in Gideon's arms with the expression of a man who has seen the full range of what a life contains, the absolute lowest. And now this. He said, "She's got Gideon's coloring." "She does," Tessa said. "Going to be stubborn?" "Probably." "Good," Amos said. "Stubborn people last." He came in and held Clara with the easy competence of a man who had held many babies over many decades, and Clara looked at him with her unfocused assessment, and Amos said quietly, to no one in particular, "Hello, girl. You picked yourself a good mountain. The years built the way years do on a mountain in seasons, in the accumulation of small specific things that are not dramatic individually, but constitute a life collectively." The timber operation stabilized and grew. The legal work from Cole's investigation wound through the courts with the grinding patience of official processes everywhere. 11 of the 14 fraudulent property cases fully resolved, 3 remaining in ongoing proceedings because the evidence was complicated. Tessa continued the organizational work through all of it, corresponding with Cole's office, helping families understand what was happening in language that didn't require legal training. Occasionally driving down to sit beside someone in a courthouse waiting room and explain, clearly and without condescension, what the documents in front of them actually meant. Ruth and Walt Calloway got their dairy farm back in April of the second year. Walt walked his own fields before sunrise the morning they moved back, and Ruth wrote Tessa a letter that said only, "He's home." Tessa kept that letter in the almanac behind the figures. Amos talked about retirement with the frequency of men who have no intention of actually retiring, and Tessa arranged the timber yard operations to shift weight toward the younger men without making the shift visible, because Amos's dignity was worth more than the administrative efficiency of announcing a transition. Bishop died on a warm night in early spring, found peaceful in the morning in his spot near the stove. Gideon said it was appropriate Bishop had never done anything that wasn't on his own terms. Clara, who was 3 and had strong opinions about most things, insisted they mark the spot in the yard, which they did, and she visited it regularly with the serious purpose of a child who takes memorial responsibility extremely seriously. Clara grew up knowing the photograph on the dresser. She knew Lydia's name and Nell's name. She knew the story of Gerald the tin horse, and she knew that the replacement Gerald on the windowsill of the rebuilt room was not the original but was standing in for him, which she found both logical and satisfying. She called Lydia and Nell the before people, which was her own coinage at age 5, and which Gideon heard once and could not speak for full minute after, not from grief exactly, but from the particular quality of being seen accurately by someone who hadn't planned to see you at all. She was, as Amos had predicted, stubborn. She had opinions about the correct order of everything, and the reasons for those opinions were always specific, even when they were wrong, which Tessa recognized because she had been the same way at the same age and had never entirely grown out of it. She was also, underneath the stubbornness, genuinely kind in the practical, unpretentious way of children who have been raised around people doing real work, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that shows up as noticing when something needs doing and doing it. Gideon taught her to read timber the way his father had taught him, walking the upper operation on her days out of school, showing her how to assess a stand, how to read the grain, how to know which trees were ready and which needed another season. She was 7 and she was serious about it. He was serious with her about it, which she found, Tessa could see, more valuable than any form of simplification would have been. Tessa taught her the accounts. Numbers first, then what the numbers meant, then how to check whether what the numbers said matched what reality said, because the gap between those two things was where trouble usually lived. Clara had a quick arithmetic mind, quicker than Tessa's had been at the same age, and she liked the problem-solving aspect of it, the detective quality of following a figure until it revealed its truth. She was, Tessa thought sometimes, watching her daughter work through a problem at the kitchen table, going to be genuinely formidable. Not in a way that would be comfortable for anyone who underestimated her. In the way of people who are competent and know it and have been taught by the specific example of their parents that competence is most valuable when it's directed at something that actually matters. The orchard bore its first real crop in the 7th year. Tessa walked down the slope of her 200 acres on a September morning, the light at the particular late summer angle that makes ordinary gold into something else. And she stood at the first winesap she'd planted, and she looked at it for a long time. The tree was not large. 7 years is not enough to produce a large apple tree. But it was real-shaped, bearing, the upper branches heavy with fruit, that had spent 7 cold mountain winters becoming exactly what it was supposed to be. She picked one apple. She held it. The weight of it was specific and real. She bit into it, slow, cold, sweet. The cold had done what Gideon had said it would, what her grandfather had said it would, concentrated the sugar, tightened the flavor into something more precise than a lower elevation version of the same variety would have produced. It was the best apple she could remember eating, and she was almost certain the assessment was honest and not simply the bias of 7 years waiting. She stood in the orchard on her own 200 acres in the September light, and she thought about the kitchen table in the Vale farmhouse and the papers slammed down and Crow's two words, "sign it," and the way. Her father's hands had shaken reaching for the pen. She thought about the courthouse, the cold morning, the smell of lamp oil and old wood, the papers she'd signed to become a wife in a room that the town was treating as a funeral. She thought about the wagon ride up the mountain in silence, and the first night lying awake, listening to the pine trees and thinking, survive this. That was the plan. Just survive it. She had survived it. She had also built something on the other side of it, which was different from surviving, and the difference was the whole point. Footsteps behind her on the slope. Clara came down at full speed, which was her only speed outdoors, and pulled up beside Tessa, breathing hard, and looked at the apple in her mother's hand, with that expression, the one that had been there since she was born, specific and ready to assess. "Is it good?" she said. Tessa handed it to her. Clara bit into it. She chewed. She considered it with real seriousness, the way she considered everything she actually cared about. "Yes," she said, not with excitement, just as a determination of fact. "Yes," Tessa agreed. Gideon came down the slope at his own pace. He had never moved faster than he needed to, and he was not going to start for an apple harvest. He came and stood beside them, and he looked at the orchard, all 20 trees in the morning light, 7 years of slow growth and cold winters, and the specific stubbornness of things that have been planted by people who intend to stay. He did not speak for a while. Clara moved off down the row, biting the apple, examining each tree in turn with her running internal commentary. "She's going to have opinions about every single one of them," Tessa said. "She has opinions about everything," Gideon said. "I wonder where that comes from," she said. He looked at her sideways. She looked back. Neither of them said anything further about it. He reached over and took the remainder of the apple she was holding and finished it in 2 bites, which was practical and also entirely characteristic. And she allowed it without comment because she had learned which things were worth commenting on and which things were just him. They stood together in the orchard on a September morning. In the life they had built out of the materials available to them, the crisis and the papers, and the wrong numbers, and the locked room, and the fire, and the federal warrants, and the long legal aftermath, and the rootstock ordered before it was. Spoken out loud because it needed to be real first. Tessa thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known at 19. She knew that survival was not a destination, that you did not arrive at safety and stop. That the people who confused surviving with living were people who had forgotten or never learned that what you survive is only the raw material. What you build from it is the actual question. She knew that the men who take things from people count fear to keep them in place. Count on isolation. Count on the particular exhaustion of people who have been damaged enough that fighting back seems like more than they have. Crow had operated for years on exactly that accounting. He had been right about most of his calculations. He had been wrong about her, and wrong about Gideon, and wrong about Amos's careful eyes, and Cole's gray coat, and Ruth Calloway crossing out a word in a letter because she wanted to get it right. He had been wrong about what happens when frightened people find each other. She knew that repair was not restoration. The house had better beams after the fire. The orchard was on a more carefully chosen slope than anything planted in haste would have been. Things rebuilt thoughtfully could be structurally superior to the original, not because damage was good, because it was not, but because the act of rebuilding made you pay attention to what you were actually constructing rather than simply inheriting what was there before. She knew that love offered again after catastrophic loss was not a betrayal of what came before. She had understood this intellectually for years. She understood it now in the specific way of watching Gideon look at Clara, of seeing the photograph on the dresser, and Gerald on the windowsill, and the orchard on the slope that Lydia had wanted, and Tessa had planted, and Clara would inherit. The before people were still here. They were part of this. Their absence had shaped the people who built this life, and their presence in memory, in the tin horse, in the name spoken aloud by a child who had made up her own tender language for them, was part of what the life was made of. She knew that 7 years was not a long time, and that she had many more ahead of her, and that she intended to be difficult about it, to push against the easy version of things, to ask for the real numbers, to plant the harder variety that took longer to bear because the cold would make it better. Clara came back up the slope with an apple in each hand, conducting a direct comparison with the focused energy of a person who has decided that a thing is worth doing properly. "Mama," she said, "the one from the middle tree is different. More shade down there," Tessa said. "Slower sugar." Clara bit one and then the other and looked between them. "I like the top one more," she said, "but the middle one is also good." "That's exactly right," Tessa said. Gideon looked at his daughter moving back down the row, carrying her 2 apples, and her opinions and her 7-year-old certainty that everything worth knowing could be figured out if you paid enough attention. He watched her with the expression that had replaced, gradually and incompletely and honestly, the expression he'd worn for years on this mountain, the one that had looked to Red Hollow like danger and had been, all along, simply a man carrying more than he should have been carrying alone. "She's going to be something," he said. "She already is," Tessa said. He looked at her. "So are you," he said quietly, "just a statement." She looked at him, at the scarred jaw, the burned hands, and the face that a town had decided was monstrous before it had troubled itself to look. At the man who had ordered rootstock without telling her, because he needed it to be real first. Who had held a tin horse in his burned hand and said she used to line them up across the breakfast table and make me name each one before I was allowed to eat. Who had stood in a courtroom and said, "Yes, I believe it was preventable," in the flat, careful voice of a man who has been holding a thing for years and has finally been given somewhere official to put it. "So are you," she said back. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The mountain held them the way it held everything, without preference, without ceremony, with the simple massive fact of its presence. It had been here before any of this and would be here after, and it did not distinguish between the years of the locked room and the years of the orchard, between the fire and the harvest, between the Tessa who had ridden up this road in the cold believing she was being sentenced, and the Tessa standing in September light eating an apple she'd planted herself. But she could make that distinction. That was the specific gift of being human and alive, and paying attention, the ability to know that this morning was not that morning, that this life was not the one that had seemed inevitable on the courthouse steps, that the space between what looks like the end and what is actually a beginning is sometimes very small, and what determines which one it is has less to do with circumstances than with the particular stubbornness of the people inside them. She had been stubborn. Gideon had been patient, which was its own form of stubborn. Amos had kept careful watch for 12 years and shown up when it counted. Edwin had driven a wagon up a mountain and turned around without needing to be thanked. Cole had worn a gray coat and done the work. Ruth Calloway had crossed out a word and found a better one. None of them had been perfect. None of them had done it cleanly, or without cost, or without moments of failing each other in ways that had required repair. That was the actual shape of it, not the clean story, not the version where everyone did the right thing at the right moment, for the right reason. The real version, where people were afraid, and sometimes let the fear make them smaller, and then sometimes found, in the particular pressure of a moment that required more, that they were capable of being larger than the fear. She reached up and picked one more apple from the first winesap she'd planted. She held it. 7 years, slow, cold, sweet, worth every day of the waiting and all the cold winters that had made it what it was. She took a bite. Below her, Clara was arguing with an apple tree about something, making her case to it in the earnest, unstoppable way of a child who genuinely believes that the right argument can move anything. Beside her, Gideon was watching Clara with that expression, the real one, the one underneath every other one. Above them, the mountain rose in the September light, the way it always had and would keep doing, indifferent and permanent and beautiful. Tessa ate her apple. She was home.